both just like the call and the welcome that we kind of already did yesterday. And then I'll follow up with what the program is for the rest of the day. So I would like to say just a few words about why we're commencing the symposium, and to share information about the Saturday Free School for Philosophy and Black Liberation in particular. The Saturday Free School is a 10-year-old school consisting of people bonded by their commitment to the political education of the total population. The Saturday Free School was a project started by Dr. Anthony Montero out of Temple University. The class that Dr. Montero was teaching then, over time changed and grew into the free school that others who are not familiar with the Saturday Free School will meet today. Each individual of the free school was able to grow and mature as human beings because of the Saturday Free School. Each person who came to the free school was connected to another member already a part of the free school. So the free school develops in its numbers like roots of a tree. And the tree can only grow if there are strong roots, which, for our purpose, are always going to be tied to the people. The people involved in the free school come from a variety of backgrounds of race, religion, and parts of the world. Our beliefs and ideology guide how we see the world and act towards other people. The example that we have of Martin Luther King and his single garment of destiny is thus not a principle of the past, but alive in our minds. Our commitment towards each other in the free school is then grounded in the optimism and spirit of revolutionary possibilities. We believe it is possible to actually transform society from war and poverty to peace and prosperity of the people. This belief holds true in our hearts because we were transformed by the political education we received in free school. It is only through transformative and honest political education that one is able to be a better human being and help change society. So this symposium is a part of the political education of the people around us and ourselves. We are transformed by the work leading up to this project, but this project is not in of itself. Throughout this year alone, members of the free school commenced other programs, our most recent being that of the celebration and commemoration of the 100th anniversary of the Communist Party of China. Or another event being that on the hope for brotherhood between India and China. And we have many upcoming events, such as the 10th anniversary of the Saturday Free School. The work of the Saturday Free School for Philosophy and Black Liberation helps us politically engage and understand this moment, which includes being able to have the courage to face the central political questions of our time, to figure out how to understand the honest and revolutionary political line to assert, and help guide the impulse of the people in their interests. Further, the free school serves to develop a political left that the people deserve, one which will struggle and stand for a positive peace. Political education and ideological clarity thus help pave the way for the people towards peace and unity. And this is why we have a symposium on Henry Winston, starting with the point of a strategy for freedom. Now I read the call that we wrote, called Henry Winston, His Vision for Freedom and Hope in Our Time. A call. Henry Winston was born in 1911 in Mississippi in the very shadow of the defeat of Black Reconstruction. The lives of Black folk at that time were not that different than during chattel slavery. They had no rights, worked land they could not own, and never rose beyond crushing debt and deep poverty. The working mass of black folk ultimately constituted a black proletariat, super exploited and racially oppressed. Many of Winston's relatives and neighbors had been slaves. His mother headed his family, which included 2 sisters. Escaping Mississippi, the family moved to Kansas City, Missouri. The poverty and racial oppression of Mississippi followed them, forcing Winston to drop out of school and seek work by going on the road. Amid the collapse of the world capitalist economy and the start of the Great Depression of the 1930s, Winston found himself part of a generation of young people who were a stranded population, uneducated, unemployed, homeless, hungry, and without futures. They were a vast army of the unemployed. They traveled in freight cars, lived in hobo camps on the side of railroad tracks. Of this vast army, many gave up. Some turned to crime and hopelessness. Winston found, among youth like himself, the unemployed movement and the unemployed councils that believed in fighting back rather than giving up. Here, he met members of the Young Communist League and the Communist Party. He began to study politics, philosophy, and economics. He came to realize that there were few, if any, individual answers for the mass of impoverished and destitute youth, and that struggle was their sole hope. The life lessons Winston learned in his early life would be a compass helping him navigate contradictions and obstacles for the rest of his life. Winston joined the Young Communist League, rising quickly to become its national organizational secretary. He studied Marxism-Leninism in the Soviet Union at the Lenin School. Here he met communists and revolutionaries from around the world. He saw that the revolutionary process was a world process, and the class struggle in the U.S. was part of a vaster struggle that included the anti-colonial struggles in Africa, India, and China. He learned that the black struggle was linked to the movements of the darker peoples around the world. More than a decade before Winston arrived at the Lenin School, figures like Chu Dai, Deng Xiaoping, and Zhou Enlai, leaders of the Chinese Revolution, Ho Chi Minh of Vietnam, as well as revolutionaries from Haiti, South Africa, and Egypt had attended. In the throes of the economic collapse, Winston concluded that to prevent another such crisis, and to save the young generation from complete ruin, the system of capitalism had to be replaced by socialism. He believed reforms, like many of those enacted by the Roosevelt administration, were significant, but could not solve the general and intensifying crisis of capitalism. He saw the fight as two-sided, for radical, democratic, political, and economic reforms under capitalism, and for socialism. This was not an academic matter to be achieved. It is an alliance of the multiracial working class with the black freedom struggle that was necessary. For him, the working class could not effectively fight for itself and its class interests if it could not overcome all the elements of ruling class ideology which infected its ranks, first and foremost being white supremacy. In this regard, he saw the rise of the Congress of Industrial Organizations, the CIO, and the organizing into unions of unorganized workers in the automobile, steel, mining, shipping, and transportation, and other industries based on the principle of black and white unite and fight as an important step forward. But the working class must fight all instances of racist terror against black workers and black people generally. In the fight against racism, Winston joined the struggle for the freedom of the Scottsboro Boys, the 9 black youth charged with raping 2 white girls on a freight train. These were crimes they did not commit. The fight was to save them from being executed and ultimately to win their freedom. This became an international campaign in the fight against U.S. racism and for the rights of black folk. They were saved from execution, but spent long years in prison. For the rest of his life, Winston fought for the freedom of political prisoners, highlighted by his leading the struggle to free Angela Davis. During this time, Winston joined the Council of African Affairs, headed by the revolutionary and anti-colonialist Paul Robeson, connecting, as he would throughout his life, black freedom with African independence. Winston rose quickly in the Communist Party and was educated to its Central Committee, to its Central Committee. The rise of fascism as a world movement and a threat to democracy and socialism found Winston becoming a fighter against fascism in Europe and in the US. He supported the democratic forces in Spain and defended the Soviet Union when it was attacked by Hitler. After Japan's attack on the Pearl Harbor, he joined the US Navy, which at that time was a completely racist and segregated institution with all armed forces. Winston, like the Communist Party and most progressives, would be tested after the end of World War II. The United States rose to be the dominant economic and military power in the world, committed to restoring the global capitalist system, including a new form of colonialism in Asia and Africa. This included a Cold War with the Soviet Union, the buildup of nuclear weapons, war in Korea, and attacks upon democratic and civil rights at home. At the same time, a movement from within the Communist Party arose to turn it into an association of leftists and essentially the left wing of the Democratic Party, which would be something like the Democratic Socialists of America today, rather than a unique revolutionary and independent political party. Winston and others successfully resisted this. However, figures like W.E.B. Du Bois, Paul Robeson, and Winston were soon targeted by the United States government as foreign agents because of their opposition to nuclear weapons and colonialism, especially in Africa. Winston was indicted, convicted, and sentenced to serve 6 years in federal prison. He lost his sight in prison due to medical neglect. In prison, Winston restudies W.E.B. Du Bois' writings on race, democracy, and Pan-Africanism. The study would define his theoretical practice for the rest of his life. His search for the essence of the U.S. revolutionary process and its connections to the world's anti-colonial and revolutionary struggles drew him deeper into Du Bois' writings. He must have certainly been drawn to the chapter in Black Reconstruction in America on the dictatorship of the Black proletariat in Mississippi, the state of his birth. Du Bois' groundbreaking conceptualized that the African slaves were a proletariat further opened the scientific possibilities for Winston's thinking. Certainly, like Du Bois, Winston viewed the colonialization and neo-colonialization of Africa as central to the enormous profits of the West and its financial and industrial corporation and to the stability of the capitalist world system. He viewed Pan-Africanism in Du Bois's articulation as part of the world struggle against imperialism. Upon his release from prison, Winston threw himself completely into the struggle, rising to be chairman of the Communist Party and a respected figure in the world communist movement. He viewed the world communist movement as the leading force for peace and democracy on a world scale. He sought to link the world communist movement to the broader global struggles, drawing him to the World Peace Council and its leader, Ramesh Chandra. Winston viewed the special position of the Black working class in the overall fight for democracy, peace, and socialism as central, leading to his formulation of the centrality of the Black freedom movement. The concept of centrality meant that the Black freedom movement is part and parcel of every progressive and radical current of struggle in the United States. For Winston, rather than a separate struggle, the Black freedom movement was a strategic component of the revolutionary and democratic processes in the United States. For him, it stood alongside the class struggle and important to understanding the essence of the revolutionary process in the United States. For this reason, Winston fought ideologically against all forces to diminish the historic role of Black people in the United States or the African anti-colonial struggle. He was committed to building the Black left within the Black movement and within the general struggle in the United States. As for Africa, he was particularly concerned with communist parties and left and radical movements. For instance, he had close ties to the communist parties of the Sudan and South Africa. He also had close ties to the African National Congress of South Africa and the Revolutionary Democratic Parties in Guinea, and the People's Republic of the Congo, and Cape Verde. He was particularly close to the Cuban Revolution and its paramount leader, Fidel Castro. Winston's vision is anchored to his efforts to scientifically understanding the unique essence of the revolutionary process in the United States, its substance and multiple forms. It was his view that such an understanding could ground a practice of unity and struggle against the monopoly capitalist system. This effort found him joining communist theory to Du Boisian theory. These theoretical discoveries ultimately constitute a new synthesis, which advances a practice of unity and struggle in our time. Henry Winston, as a thinker, is an important contributor to the struggles for peace, democracy, and socialism. In his two books, Strategy for a Black Agenda and Race, Class, and Black Liberation, alongside many essays and speeches, we witness him working out this new theoretical synthesis. The Saturday Free School organizes this 3-day symposium to honor and study the vision of Henry Winston and to further develop that vision. In this moment of deep crisis for the youth and young people, and people generally, the struggle for ideological clarity is critical. There is, moreover, a pressing need for what Martin Luther King Jr. called a radical revolution of values, to shift the thinking of youth and the people from a thing-oriented and materialist way of viewing the world to a people and humanity-centered way of thinking. Side by side with the new values in people's culture, including music, poetry, novels, dance, films, videos, paintings, and all forms of culture has to be created. What Henry Winston fought to achieve is now passed to a new generation. A generation that can spare no effort to know the world in order that it might be changed. We are optimistic that the youth and people of the United States can achieve the lofty goal of radically transforming our society. Okay, that's the end of the call.
Wow.
There. And thank you. To continue on with the program, for our second day and in the morning, we're gonna have papers being read from between around 10:30 now to about 1 or so. And the first paper will be called Winston and Romesh Chandra in the Current Stage of Imperialism, followed by China and Africa, Maoism and After-Mao, and then Martin Luther King Jr. and Henry Winston, Civil Rights and Peace. I'd first like to invite Samir and Purva Chatterjee for the Winston and Romesh Chandra panel. Thank you.
Welcome everyone. So before our panel begins, I wanted to just say a few words about the vision and purpose of this opening panel for the second day. So the first panel is entitled Du Bois and Lenin, Pan-Africa and Pan-Asia in the Thought of Henry Winston. Winston's extraordinary development as a strategist and theorist was informed by his synthesis of Du Bois's writings on the color line and the black proletariat, and Lenin's analysis of the world's oppressed, rising against a common oppressor, leading him to emphasize anti-imperialism and peace as primary concerns of the Communist Party, and of anyone who strives to uplift the working class. Through this synthesis, Winston continued Du Bois's work of understanding the revolutionary essence and potential in America, and what role Black people were to play in a changing world order. Winston saw the potential for unity of the oppressed masses of the world as possible through the working classes, especially the Black working classes. Desire for peace, which was exemplified by the powerful influence of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Winston saw King's mobilization of the community in the Black freedom struggle as a testament to his belief that the revolutionary process was centered on the selfless desire to uplift others rather than focus on only one's own oppression. He led the Communist Party with this principle that internationalism was important for the Black proletariat to not just learn from other groups' struggles, but also teach the world its revolutionary ways. Drawing upon Du Bois's writing on Pan-Africanism, Winston stayed close to the leaders of the revolutionary struggles being waged in Africa, and to freedom fighter Romesh Chandra of the World Peace Council and India's independence struggle. Their friendship and collaboration symbolizes the unity of Pan-Africa and Pan-Asia in the fight against imperialism and oppression in all forms. Today, these rich historical links are hidden from us, so it is with this panel that we strive to highlight these connected struggles for peace and democracy in America and the world through the vision of Henry Winston, and discuss their importance for today's conditions. So with that, I'll introduce Purva Chatterjee and Samir Butt, who will be speaking on Winston and Romesh Chandra and the current stage of imperialism.
Good morning. In 1904, W.E.B. Du Bois wrote in his Credo to Dark Water, quote, I believe in the Prince of Peace. I believe that war is murder. I believe that armies and navies are at bottom the tinsel and braggadocio of oppression and wrong. And I believe that the wicked conquest of weaker and darker nations by nations whiter and stronger but foreshadows the death of that strength. End quote. We live in a time when the prophetic significance of these words is clearer than it has ever been before. The crisis of the West and its redoubled efforts to maintain by any means its dominance over the world makes it imperative for us to talk about peace today. Peace is and has been the most natural yearning of humanity since antiquity, the emphasis of every great civilization. The struggle for peace is the struggle for life itself, and yet any strategy for lasting peace is incomplete, which does not include an analysis of imperialism and its attacks on the very basis for peace. That is why, as we commemorate the life and legacy of Henry Winston, we also remember his longtime friend and comrade, Ramesh Chandra, one of the greatest peacemakers the world has ever seen, as an important figure for us to know and study today. Ramesh was an Indian communist who participated in the national struggle for freedom and was at the forefront of the Indian peace movement. He was one of the most important leaders and theorists of the World Peace Council, serving as its General Secretary from 1966 and as President from 1977. Before Ramesh, the World Peace Movement was primarily a European affair, limited to governmental organizations and intellectuals. Ramesh's great contribution was that he broadened the peace movement and took it to the masses, and he also fortified it by adding to it an analysis of imperialism. He believed that peace is everybody's business. It is something to be built and not just defended, and the people have the agency to turn the tide against imperialism and war. Under his leadership, the World Peace Council became the General Assembly of the peoples of the world and undertook the massive task of building a new world free from war and suffering, from exploitation and poverty, so humanity could move towards a higher stage of self-realization. For Ramesh, the World Peace Movement was the logical successor of the Indian freedom struggle, in which the people of India freed themselves from the yoke of 2 centuries of colonial oppression through the principles of non-violent resistance. He emphasized the inseparable link between the peace movement and the struggles for national liberation in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Ramesh was deeply influenced by Lenin and his early commitment to unity in the struggle for peace. He would say, quote, "One day after the Soviet Union was founded, Lenin signed the Decree of Peace. From that moment on, it became clear to the whole world that now there existed a power, a government, which based its entire foreign policy not on aggrandizement, not on expansionism, not on war, but on peace and the willingness to sacrifice for peace." End quote. For Ramesh, the Soviet Union was the bastion of the world's struggle against imperialism, Lenin's most precious gift to mankind. Along with the World Peace Council, the Soviet Union and other socialist countries like Cuba stood beside every struggle for liberation and peace in the developing world. The World Peace Council defined positive peace as not just freedom from the cost and degradation of war, but a prerequisite for the development of human potential to its fullest extent. This was also King's formulation of positive peace. Besides political independence, the struggle for peace was also, therefore, a struggle for development, for economic independence, and for the sovereignty of each country over its own natural resources. Ramesh asserted that there was hunger and poverty in the developing countries because they were robbed and plundered by neocolonialism, and not because of overpopulation and backwardness, which was the racist theory peddled by imperialist powers. He emphasized that the wealth of each nation must remain in the hands of the people and not in the hands of imperialists and monopolists, saying, quote, "Peace is oil in the hands of the people whose soil produces the oil. Peace is copper in the hands of the people of Chile." End quote. The World Peace Council's struggle for positive peace included fighting for a new international economic order, which gave to each country the right to nationalize its resources, set fair prices and tariffs, and control the activities of multinational corporations on its soil. Romesh would say, quote, "We seek to bring down the cost of living and to raise high the price of life, so that one day bread can be free and life so precious that no man shall ever buy another man's life." End quote. Romesh understood that the strength of the struggle against imperialism and for peace lies in the unity of all peace-loving peoples, of all democratic and anti-imperialist forces in every country. He believed that the peace movement could not be compartmentalized, and that the progress and advance of one people could not be separated from that of all others. The World Peace Council extended its support to the Afro-Asian Solidarity Organization, the Organization for African Unity, and the Non-Aligned Movement. It agitated against military bases of the United States, Britain, and France in the Indian Ocean, demanding that it remain a zone of peace contributing to the welfare and growth of every country. It stood with the Vietnamese people's struggle against US aggression, the struggle of the people of Palestine against Israel, and the struggle of the South African peoples against apartheid. Romesh would emphasize again and again that the imperialist countries which were behind these heinous attacks on darker humanity did not have the support of their own people who yearned for peace. In particular, the Vietnam War galvanized the peace forces in every country. In the United States, it inspired millions of citizens from all sections of society to join hands in demanding peace and social transformation for the masses. Samir will look more closely at the peace forces in America and the World Peace Council's close association with them. The US peace movement provides hope for our times about the possibilities for unity and brotherhood that can materialize even at the very epicenter of imperialist forces when a people come together in defense of justice and humanity. The gains of the peace movement were jeopardized by the virulent anti-communist policies of the United States, which had emerged as the foremost imperial power after the end of the Second World War. The threat of nuclear war between the US and the Soviet Union made world annihilation a very real possibility. In the US, anyone who raised his voice for peace was indicted as a communist or a communist sympathizer and often incarcerated or executed. Figures like Du Bois, Paul Robeson, Henry Winston, and King were all targets of this anti-communist hysteria during the McCarthy era. This would lead Du Bois to say, quote, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called communists." Is this shame for the peacemakers or praise for the communists? End quote. Ironically, while talking about defending the freedom and democracy of newly liberated nations, the US ruling class unleashed one of the most violent attacks on democratic and civil liberties at home. Furthermore, it sought to obstruct the growing unity among the peace-loving peoples of Asia and Africa, and led a campaign to weaken the friendship between them and the Soviet Union and other countries of the Socialist bloc. Romesh understood, as Baldwin did, as Reverend James Lawson did, that anti-communism stems from the ideology of white supremacy, which presumes that the whole world should want to become white and subscribe to the white ideal of democracy, however divorced it is from the general upliftment and welfare of the masses. It stems from the racism that lies at the very heart of Western imperialism and its threats to peace. Romesh saw that racism and racial discrimination were not just crimes against humanity, they helped to create the very basis for war. The meaning of this becomes clear when we consider that every war fought and lost by the United States in the last 70 years has been in Asia. If US soldiers could burn little children with napalm in Vietnam, it was because they had been trained in racism, trained to despise the Vietnamese people and to consider them less than animals. In the Du Boisian tradition, Romesh, like Henry Winston, strove to bring to world attention the significance of the color line in the struggle for peace. He recognized, as Winston did, the centrality of the black freedom struggle in the broader world movement for peace and justice that included the anti-colonial struggles of Asia and Africa. The civil rights movement was the moral vanguard of the forces for peace and against imperialism in America, with King calling for a positive peace that did not just mean the absence of tension, but the presence of justice. Ramesh stood with the civil rights movement and called for unity and solidarity between the fight against racism in the United States and that in Southern Africa. He also understood that the struggle for peace was as important for the white people of the United States as it was for the blacks, because the stockpiling of arms and weapons of mass destruction for racist wars abroad worsened the economic condition at home, leading to widespread unemployment, inflation, and poverty. He called for unity of the working class across the color line, for solidarity between the black freedom struggle and the white workers who, quote, have nothing to gain and everything to lose if this racism and racial discrimination is allowed to be continued, end quote. This is extremely significant for our times as we watch the US ruling class attack the suffering and discontented white worker and attempt to frame him as the real perpetrators of racism and white supremacy. King emphasized the inseparable link between racism and war when he said, quote, one cannot be just concerned with civil rights. It is very nice to drink milk at an unsegregated lunch counter, but not when there is strontium 90 in it, end quote. The US ruling class looked upon King with patronizing tolerance as long as he was non-violently fighting for racial equality. However, in that decisive moment of his life, when he connected the fight against racism and injustice to the fight against poverty and war, he became a threat and had to be eliminated. King's true legacy is that of a uniter of the people, of the forces for peace and justice against the forces of war. Ramesh would point out that the ideology behind the treatment meted out to King was the same behind the attempt to distort the legacy of another man whom King greatly admired, Mahatma Gandhi. He noted that Gandhi was diminished and portrayed by the imperialists as, quote, something of a crank, someone who believed in peculiar things like non-violence and who dressed in a peculiar way. What they sought to hide from the peoples of the world was the true image of Gandhi as a fighter against imperialism, against poverty, against racism and war, end quote. Ramesh warned us of another way Western imperialism conspires to dilute the connection between racism and imperialism by creating the false impression that racism exists in every country of the world. In recent times, we have seen intellectuals with colored faces and white voices being authorized to speak the language of the ruling class on race. The attacks on Gandhi, on India and its anti-colonial struggle are concrete examples of this conspiracy. Ramesh also warned us against imperialism's attempt to confuse world opinion about socialist and communist regimes on the pretext of championing human rights. In recent times, we have also seen the US ruling class attack communist countries striving for the self-actualization of their people as authoritarian and undemocratic, while failing to provide for American citizens the most basic human rights. We must ask, is poverty and hunger a human right? Is debilitating addiction and crime among the youth a human right? Isn't the right to work and live a life of dignity a human right? Ramesh Chandra is a figure for our times. The concepts he and the World Peace Council developed in the struggle for peace are as relevant to us today as when they were formulated. We stand at the brink of a monumental shift in world powers. The crisis of the West is a crisis of imperialism. The people of the United States are rising in revolt and challenging the legitimacy of a ruling class that favors wealth and profit over human beings. The rise of China and the shift to a multipolar world order is seen as an existential threat by the American ruling class. Like a cornered beast, it has resorted to desperate measures. We are seeing the creation of the objective conditions for a new Cold War. This is a time for introspection on the past, a time to seek ideological clarity. We must engage in a deep study of the life and legacy of Ramesh Chandra and reinterpret it for our moment. We must seek a new economic order with humanity at the center of its concern and carry on the struggle for peace, which is not yet complete. Lastly, we must view, as Ramesh did, the struggle for peace as our moral obligation to the children of the world. What world will we leave behind for the immortal child of today, tomorrow, and the future? Ramesh would say, quote, children represent life. Children deserve a fullness of life. They deserve beauty and the light of knowledge, They deserve to look around themselves and feel optimistic about the future. Joy and happiness are their birthright. End quote. We cannot give our children their birthright in a world which is at war, where famines created by man takes their life away before it can blossom. In a climate of deep ideological confusion and moral poverty, we cannot give our children such meaningful education that they might grow up to be men and women who can lead the people in the forward march of humanity. Our struggle is the struggle to build a world where children can realize their true potential, where their imagination and talents are not fettered by poverty and hunger and racism, where they can grow up surrounded by beauty and goodness and truth. For our children, we must pledge, as Ramesh Chandra pledged, that, quote, we shall not rest until we achieve what Du Bois aimed to do, what Paul Robeson aimed to do, what all the great leaders of the liberation struggles everywhere aim to do. We are going to create the kind of world in which all children shall play and in which no child will be burned by napalm, no child will go hungry, no child will be thrown into the ghetto, and in which all children will know what a sweet tastes like. End quote.
Hello, my name is Samir. I believe yesterday someone asked the question, what would Henry Winston be doing today? There's another question, what does a peace movement look like today? And I think to answer this question, I'm going to be presenting on the World Peace Council tour in 1975, organized when Ramesh Chandra was the General Secretary. And the purpose of me speaking to you on this is to observe what that tour in 1975 was trying to accomplish and how it tried to accomplish that. And some background on the World Peace Council. It was founded in the late 1940s in the context of the aftermath of the Second World War over a series of 2 conferences. And the world communist movement had pivoted to a peace offensive with the moral authority granted to it by the defeat of fascism and the Axis powers after World War II. So the World Peace Council was riding on this momentum. This peace offensive was the strategy of a world movement that consisted of communists and their fellow travelers, and the World Peace Council members belonged to many countries, both developed and developing. When Ramesh Chandra was Secretary General of the World Peace Council, they had organized a multi-city tour of the United States all across the country. The purpose of this tour was to mobilize the public in favor of detente in what they called the New Stockholm campaign. In 1950, they had built a campaign called the Stockholm Appeal, a signature collecting campaign to promote nuclear disarmament and prevent atomic war between the US and the USSR. As I read about this tour across the US, I thought that the character of the tour and the political activities of the World Peace Council delegates were nothing like we have today. And I will describe their tour and activities and illuminate on how and why the World Peace Council delegation was different. This tour was led by a delegation of veteran anti-fascists consisting of Ramesh Chandra, Josef Sarankowicz, a leader of Poland, Purabi Mukherjee, who was the General Secretary of the Congress Party of India, James Lamond of the British Labour Party, Yakov Lamoko, editor of the Moscow News, and Dr. Carlton Goodlett, a president of the National Newspapers Publishers Association, the Black Press of America, as well as being a World Peace Council member. And they were also joined, among other delegates from the World Peace Council, either the organization or friends. They were also joined by Reverend Ralph Abernathy, who was a president of honor of the World Peace Council, in addition to still leading the Southern Christian Leadership Council, formerly headed by Martin Luther King. And what I hope to present to you today is that you could draw a straight line from the Civil Rights Movement to the World Peace Council, and that's what the delegates tried to do in their tour of America. These leaders brought significant experience and moral authority to the organization, and their objective was to consolidate the peace forces. Now we're talking about a tour in America, so we're talking about organizations fighting for peace in the most violent country on earth. In addition, with the end of Vietnam having ended recently, there was strong anti-war sentiment amongst the masses of people. I've given you who participated in the tour, at least the big names. The tour began on the East Coast in Washington, D.C., and the World Peace Council, despite being maligned and red-baited by pro-imperialist forces, met with congressmen and senators to discuss matters of peace and détente. From there, the tour proceeded to New York City, where the delegation was awarded the Bicentennial Medal from the city. As one of the many accolades they were given on tour. They would receive many awards and keys to the city, including from the many cities. I just couldn't stand here and list to you awards that they had won or mean anything. But back in the day, you would receive like the key to the city to Detroit or New York, and this was a great honor. The World Peace Council was going around the U.S. receiving all these awards, proclamations from city councils. It was very interesting to see, and also a blast from the past. The World Peace Council moved on from D.C. to New York. The delegation would also travel to the other coast, to San Francisco. And they went from speaking to statesmen in D.C. and New York, to the media in the Bay Area. And the response by media to the World Peace Council tour was described by the delegates as overwhelming. After San Francisco, the delegates would split up, going to LA and Seattle, and again, they would be interviewed. They would be spending most of their days doing interviews in newspapers, radio, TV shows of all sorts of formats, one-on-one interviews, town hall interviews, talk shows, where the talk show host would go and hand the microphone to everyone in the audience. And that's just something we don't see today. After San Francisco, the delegates would split up, going to LA and Seattle, underscoring the complexity of the logistics of the trip and how advanced the organization and communication was within the WPC to organize such a tour. I'm bringing up the geography of the tour because the second leg of the trip was a very interesting political choice by the organizers. The second half of the tour began by visiting Detroit, and the remainder of the tour went to cities in the Rust Belt. After Detroit, the tour would visit Cleveland, South Bend, Milwaukee, and lastly Chicago. I think for those of us who have been studying King at the end of his life, we have brought up that near the end of his life, he was attempting to move the civil rights movement north from the south into the northern cities. And we see that the World Peace Council has arranged this tour in such a way that they agree, where one part is getting business done, going to New York, going to DC, going to the Bay Area, but the second half is a deep engagement with many working people and their cities. And these events that they planned and participated in, they ranged from massive rallies. One of my sources described people overflowing on Riverside Church in San Francisco. 1,500 people coming to see the World Peace Council while they're being maligned publicly, while they're being called, while they're being red-baited. These massive rallies, but these events also range from massive rallies at speaking centers and churches to intimate dinners hosted by faculty, hosted by other delegates of the World Peace Council, hosted by friends of the World Peace Council. And it reflected a variety of types of engagement with people, not just rallies, not just protests, not just speaking, but also something more human. Regardless, these delegates had deep engagement with the masses of people by interacting with organizations such as women's organizations, Chicano organizations, Black organizations, fraternal organizations, and all kinds of other civil organizations. Like I mentioned, they met with faculty. They would meet with whole faculties of universities and sit down, regardless of whether it was with the theology department or the physics department. Regardless of the venue or the diverse participants, the message was the same. Peace and jobs are a primary concern, and freedom is indivisible. In reading Romesh Chandra for preparation for this event, one can see the influence of Dr. King. So to answer the question that I presented, what is the character of this peace movement? What did this tour mean? And why did the World Peace Council do this tour? Why did they do their second tour, in the Rust Belt? The World Peace Council wanted to create a broad base of all sorts of organizations, not just one racial group, not just one cause, not just Palestine, not just South Africa. A broad brush of struggles, a world house. In South Bend, Reverend Ralph Abernathy joined the tour, and it was described as, this is 1975, this is after the Civil Rights Movement, but it is described as shutting down the city. Everyone's attending. All 3 local TV channels hosted coverage of the Peace Council tour. Wherever they went and whoever was speaking, all the delegates were on the same page. They were connecting jobs and peace. They were connecting the military spending and the economic dispossession of people because of that military spending. And they were also connecting how war and economic dispossession are essentially linked. And all the World Peace Council tour delegates were on the same page about this. Maybe I have some interesting quotes I should read. Romesh Chandra said in Seattle, "We have achieved political détente, but this cannot continue without military détente, or reductions of the arm race. That's why we're here. This is where the Stockholm Agreement should be brought up." Parabi Mukherjee pinpointed racism and imperialist domination as a prime cause of war. And then there was one member of the World Peace Council delegation, Joseph Sarankowitz, who gave the most fruitful presentation. He went to a high school in Milwaukee, and Joseph Sarankowitz was a prisoner at Auschwitz for 4 years, and the pamphlet that described the tour said that it was the most rewarding experience of the whole tour, was him telling these Milwaukee high school students about his 4 years in Auschwitz and, to quote the pamphlet, what war and fascism really means. So I just want to end with how we don't have this today, and the rhetorical question I want to present to you is why not? And from what I've presented to you, there's so much deep engagement, so many people participating in the movement, professors, think tanks, congressmen and women, and why don't we have this today? And I think it's a question we need to address today and moving onward, but also recognize that corporate monopoly has displaced this movement through NGOs, and those people who would be participating in this movement are not participating organically because they've been bought off by an NGO movement and they're more comfortable somewhere else. So this idea of touring and engaging with people, especially people who don't work in your office, meeting working people around the country, it's been removed with this idea that activism is a corporate 9-to-5 job, and all those people who would be passionate about helping working people have been taken out and given, professorships, NGO jobs, and think tank salaries. And this is I think one of the main problems today with why we don't have a peace movement like this today. Thank you.
Thank you, for that presentation. So next we'll move on to a short discussion and question and comment section for our panelists. Yes, if you have a question or comment, just come up to the mic.
We heard a lot of discussion about need for peace, and everybody wants peace. The question is how to get it, and this is a question that has been asked. I think it's useful to mention that the United States was created as a result of a political revolution. And we know the racist problems and that from what happened from that, but nobody today says we'd be better off as a British colony. We know that slavery was eliminated because of the Civil War. We know that there were many problems after that, but nobody in their right mind wants to go back to the years of chattel slavery. This was done by force. The revolutions that we've seen in Russia, China, Cuba, they had pre-revolutionary situations where people were ready to overthrow governments. They were ready. So what was the road to peace? Pre-revolutionary situation, Lenin talked about, he had a whole organization that was ready. And there was a pre-revolution, people were ready, and he said, go out, rob banks. If the police get in the way, beat them up, move them out of the way. And he demanded peace, bread, and land, and that was the road to peace. And after that, he ended the war, but then he came after them in the Civil War and with Hitler. So my point is that in order to get that road for peace, you need that organization that's willing to create a movement that puts in place a government, not that the American Revolution or the Civil War did, because that was for a minority. You need a government that's going to act not for everybody, but for the majority. That's what, and that's how, in my opinion, how you break down the divisions that they consciously sow. So that's all I have to say. Thank you.
I think this is a topic that has come up quite often. I've been thinking about this conversation of violence versus non-violence, especially since Winston was a Leninist. And I think there's a quote from Carl Jung that I heard recently that goes, it is the tortured that tortures. And it's from a Gandhian perspective, using violence to further your political cause is only going to delay violence in the future, but only the force of non-violence can end the hurt that hurts.
I'd just like to add to this. I completely agree with what the gentleman said, Stephen said, that often the road to peace is bloody, but that is why we make a distinction between positive peace and negative peace, like King did, like Ramesh did, like Lenin did also, which says that we're talking about a world which is free of injustice, not just tensions between powers. So it's not fought out between world powers, but then we want a world where the people can live in justice and they can live in peace. And also I think because you brought up Gandhi, I remember something that Gandhi used to say, that he valued violence over cowardice if violence was the way to peace. That it's always better to be brave and stand up to the enemy than be a coward, even if it meant you had to use violence. But the objective is positive peace, where the masses can live in a situation where their lives have dignity, where they can work, where, they have justice, to sum it up. Yeah, I just want to add that.
I would like to mention one thing. I think to Brother Stephen, I don't think you were here last night, but we did talk a little bit about how there are some prominent historians who consider themselves historians of the U.S. left that indeed do believe the United States would have been better off as a British colony. And perhaps slavery would have been abolished much earlier. And those people have also congealed around the 1619 Project and the so-called settler colonial thesis, which is quite popular in radical circles. So unfortunately, that's an idea that I don't think would have been conceived back in the 1970s, but today it's very much in vogue. But I also wanted to add that, related to that point also, to just the comments which you all had made, and what was brought out in your presentations is that the World Peace Council, while many prominent figures in it were members of communist parties, it was a broad front. You had people like Reverend Ralph Abernathy, who were part of the civil rights movement and who were against anti-communism, but were not themselves communists. And also significantly, you had nations and parties like the ruling party of India at the time, Congress Party, which was very committed to the peace movement in the World Peace Council, but were again not necessarily Marxist-Leninists. And in fact, as you brought out as well, the figure of a person like Ramesh Chandra, you also had a synthesis of this Gandhian idea of nonviolence with the Marxist-Leninist conceptions of a class struggle and the Soviet Union's policy of peace and so on. And so it was significant because, in fact, the World Peace Council, to my knowledge, is one of the few organizations that actually had principled members from the first, the second, and third worlds, meaning members from the imperialist nations, people of conscience, people from within the second world, which is the socialist bloc, and of course the third world as well. So it's another reason why it's very significant. So maybe I just, as a question, I'd like to ask you, if you can feel free to respond to these comments, but also what came up looking at some of this material as far as the importance of political education, or how you see them conducting political education in that time?
So I just wanted to make a point about
Let me add to Jahan's on political education. I think it's, in thinking about the peace movement for today, I think it's tough because in the 70s, there was a lot of consciousness, and I think that the I've read that the independence of the African nations woke African Americans to the question of if they have nations, then what nation do I belong to? And so there was already, because of the historical conditions after World War II, after Vietnam, a lot of anti-war consciousness, and in what the World Peace Council delegates said to people, I would say it was very Kingian. So jobs, peace, anti-war, anti-racism, the three evils, so to say. And it was uncanny in how similar Winston and Ramesh Chandra were, despite being continents away. And I think that was likely because of the influence of King and Du Bois. As far as political education, I would say I got a hint at their slogans, but there's so little information, as you know. There's so little information out there. It needs to be looked at more. And that the political education that was going on was taking part in intimate conversations and large mass rallies with slogans.
To that, I'd like to add on the question of political education is I think one of the biggest contributions of Ramesh and the World Peace Council, I mentioned it to some extent, but it really was to go to the masses with an analysis of imperialism, which underlies why there is war and why the conditions for peace cannot be created. And for instance, I think about the situation today when we are at the brink of a war, and the reasons being given for that is some human rights situation with China and Taiwan and so on. And I'm just thinking about how a young person views this, especially when there's so much attack by US corporate media on people, not just young people in this country, but people in my country too, in India, where they think, oh, okay, so this is a valid basis for going to war. But then, if you try to see it from the lens which Ramesh Chandra and his engagement with the masses provides us, this is not a war to defend freedom and democracy. It is a war to defend imperialism and its hegemony over the world. So I guess by going to the people and trying to explain to them what the cause of war was, what lies at the heart of war, well, that's political education, and that's what they believed was important for a lasting and irreversible struggle for peace.
So we'll take one more question before moving on to the next set of presentations.
I just wanted to make that the question of King and Winston and Du Bois, all these parallels of them reading about Lenin and the devastation that King had personally suffered, because one knew that he knew things that Lenin were, just by his remarks, once he mentioned the value of the people in their communities. So, and the kind of question I'm asking is that, what do you think that he addressed those things, and that it made him more of a threat than a man of the cloth, and they knew that he spoke things globally through Lenin and not just opposing Lenin, as he was addressing the workers in Chicago where his life was going to be targeted, to say a few things, to think about that, say something about that. That's not just a question, but just to think that his life was much more threatened by opposing the Vietnam War, and no one else was willing to walk up on that cross to address what King had to bring, and him not analyzing Lenin's life, but what he had to live, because they all lived parallel lives.
Yeah. I say something apropos that I'd like to, expand upon the point made by Derek. Just one thing, I was around in a 1975 tour, and Henry Winston played a decisive strategic role in mobilizing the party and its allies, including the African American newspapers. I am particularly familiar with Carlton Goodlett, in San Francisco, and Mr. Murphy, who was the publisher, owner of the Afro-American newspaper in Washington and Baltimore, and I'm familiar with how the work of the party to open up avenues into the trade union movement and into, in particular, black elected officials. It was an attempt in the wake of the end of the war in Vietnam to seize upon a political moment, and it was successful. You are absolutely right. Martin Luther King was familiar with W.E.B. Du Bois, and he was familiar with Henry Winston. Back then, you couldn't go around, beating a drum, I know Martin Luther King, or Martin Luther King beating a drum, I know Henry Winston. Because that was political suicide, given the red baiting and anti-communism of the moment, and the media and the establishment would have seized upon that. But there were, as we call it, many networks, political networks, and intersecting networks, and people, and this is the point you asked about, Samir, people operated on the basis of principle and mutual respect. In other words, if we respect the work that Martin Luther King or Ralph Abernathy or the other leaders of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which in fact was in the forefront of this world peace movement, if you respected their work, you respected the integrity and so on of their political position and their vulnerabilities. So indeed, this was an attempt to strategically seize upon a moment. And I'd like to bring this back to Henry Winston. As we saw last evening, you saw that mind working. It was a strategic mind. And it was a unique mind. And thus, when Romesh came to the United States, and he often was here because of the United Nations meetings and so on, he could be regularly seen in Henry Winston's office. They were very close, very friendly, they thought alike, and I don't know it personally, but I think like many leaders in the world movement, they respected Winston's strategic mind. And everyone who came to this country, because again, this isn't in the wake of the peace movement, but of the great civil rights movement, which forever changed this country. Brother Howard, the civil rights movement, the freedom movement, forever changed this country. The country will never be as racist as it was before the civil rights movement. I'd like to make that prediction. I could be proven wrong. We are not as racist as we were, but we're not where we need to be yet. But we have to acknowledge what was achieved. There are those who would like to say, well, the civil rights movement didn't mean anything anyway. We still have white supremacy. Yes, we do still have white supremacy. And we still have capitalism. And we still have imperialism, which means we still have a lot of work to do. But you saw a strategic mind. And when they came to the United States, and when Romesh came, he wanted to meet with Winston, who he felt, and he was correct on this, and I'll say this completely. They understood that Winston understood strategically the black movement and the black people, that Winston was in touch with the Carlton Goodlets, with the Mr. Murphys, the black press, that he knew the leaders of the SCLC and they knew him. And this was very, very important. And indeed, we must learn from that moment. Of course, as Pulpa points out, we are in a different moment. You know, there is no world communist movement that undergirded what Ramesh was doing. There is no Congress Party and an Indira Gandhi in India who supported Ramesh. We don't have that now. So we're operating in some ways at a disadvantage. We do not have that strategic mind that we saw in Henry Winston. We don't have it. We have to try to produce it. But indeed, peace must be uppermost in all of our minds, in every struggle, and the fight for unity of all forces fighting for peace is so decisive. I just wanted to say that.
Thank you very much, Senior, and for your contributions. Good morning. I think this topic is both very interesting because of recent events in the moment we live in today, but it's also a very difficult topic. I wanted to begin by saying that Henry Winston's analysis of Mao and Maoism in the 1970s, in particular in his book, Strategy for a Black Agenda, published in 1973, and the theoretical framework for freedom and revolutionary strategy are not only immensely helpful in understanding the Cultural Revolution, but key to understanding the difference between then and the moment we live in today, which is what Jahan and I together will hopefully show you all, the difference. So today, before I begin talking about Henry Winston's theoretical contributions to understanding that moment for China, both domestically and internationally, I just wanted to say thank you to Henry Winston, because his connection between the Cultural Revolution, which I had only really interpreted as a domestic issue for China, and which I actually presented on at our commemoration of the 100th anniversary of the Communist Party of China. But the connection Henry Winston makes between the Cultural Revolution and China's foreign policy in that moment, which jeopardized other anti-colonial struggles happening in the world. That connection is really important, I think, and teaches us a lot in how to view the world. But I also wanted to thank Henry Winston because it was the first time I had read him actually in detail, and it's really tough because it's almost like the kind of education of such a high caliber you expect to get at school. And it's an education that teaches you how to think, but also to look around you and read the news and to deeply understand not just what's happening, but why. And then thus you have the tools to understand how you will actually free humanity. So my presentation is specifically around Winston's analysis of Maoism and China's theory during the Cultural Revolution and also their foreign policies, and why that's significant for today, both in understanding Xi Jinping, but also China and Africa in 2021, which Johan will focus on. But also, I think my presentation is not really just about Maoism. It's a presentation on providing how Henry Winston provides his fellow Americans the tools to understand who is on the side of the people and who is on the side of the imperialist. So I wanted to begin with what Henry Winston says about Mao's problems and the flaws of Maoist theory during the Cultural Revolution. And this is important because it's not just a historical thing, but actually I think it's something that permeates, it's a kind of theory that permeates today among a lot of leftists and radicals around the world and even in America, even if it doesn't have the capital M Mao in it. So the first immense contribution Henry Winston makes is his explicit connection between the Cultural Revolution domestically and internationally. And this confirms the explanation given by the 1981 Communist Party of China resolution, where they talk about the mistakes of the Cultural Revolution. But it confirms what that 1981 resolution says are ideological mistakes of Mao and what is a political war within the party due to ideological disagreement, rather than viewing the Cultural Revolution as something that's simply about personalities, and that's it. And this is Henry Winston's point. He begins by saying, the Cultural Revolution was a deliberate move by Mao to gut the party leadership, which was opposing Mao's opposition to Sino-Soviet partnership against imperialist war in Vietnam. And I'll read what he says. On page 109 of Strategy for a Black Agenda, he says, one cannot grasp the real meaning of the Cultural Revolution without understanding that Mao Zedong unleashed the hordes of Red Guards to smash the massive resistance within the Communist Party, to Mao's betrayal of the Marxist-Leninist principles of the right to self-determination internally and of proletarian internationalism. This betrayal is central to all aspects of Maoist policy within China and on a world scale. Which I think is really significant because I never connected those two. I always assumed the Cultural Revolution was about, because in the 1981 resolution, it's talking domestically, it's talking about the Cultural Revolution. You've got the party leadership because the party is contesting an ultra-leftism that's occurring in the moment, where people are targeting capitalist voters, people who they think are revisionists, people who they think are trying to introduce capitalism to China. But actually, Winston's making the point where he's saying it's not by chance that the Cultural Revolution is occurring in a moment where there's imperialist war, specifically Vietnam. And in a time during the Sino-Soviet split when there's a move for the world to unite around Vietnam, to try to resist imperialism and help Vietnam as both a struggle for Asian countries, African countries. The fact that Mao decides to do the Cultural Revolution, that's connected because you need to gut the party leadership that is not just focused on what they feel like domestic flaws, but also in order to suppress a party that is for a united front against imperialism. So I thought that was a really important point Winston was making. But in regards to Africa, also the African anti-colonial struggles, Winston starts to make an important point where he talks about a big sign of the flaws of Maoism is the fact that Maoist theory was supporting disunity. And thus China, because of its foreign policy that supported disunity, specifically on the African continent, they were joining the side of the imperialist. So the first quote I wanted to read is he talks about, actually I'll just read it. He says, Henry Winston says, in Africa, Maoist and Neo-Pan-African divisiveness is also making the struggles more arduous, and while doing so is protracting neo-colonialist domination and aggression, especially in the southern redoubt of fascist rule, where European and Japanese imperialism are directly interlocked with US strategy to bring about an African counterpart of what occurred in Indochina over the past 30 years. It is precisely because the guerrilla fighters in Mozambique, Zimbabwe, Angola, Guinea-Bissau, and South Africa are facing such arduous struggles, demanding the utmost self-reliance and self-sacrifice, that Maoist and neo-Pan-African ideology, which would isolate them from world socialist and anti-imperialist unity, must be rejected. And Henry Winston is talking at a point where it's the height of many African anti-colonial struggles, including South Africa and a lot of the former Portuguese colonies in Africa. And during this moment, what was happening with Maoist China is they were actually, because of the tensions, they were supporting, for example, in South Africa, they were supporting the Pan-African Congress, which had split from the ANC at the height of a very difficult freedom struggle. Or, for example, they refused to join, in Vietnam, they refused to join a united front with the Soviet Union against American imperialism in Vietnam. Or for the Portuguese colonies, China was actually initiating trade with Portugal, which was actually going against what a lot of these revolutions were requesting, which was a blockade on Portugal not to engage in trade. And so Henry Winston is trying to make the point, which is, if you are on the side of the people, or on the side of the revolution, you should not be supporting this kind of disunity amidst these anti-colonial struggles. And I think what Henry Winston begins to say is he's making the case of, and this is similar to the Cultural Revolution domestically, which is, what is the primary contradiction of the world? And so the issue with the Cultural Revolution, even in China, was there is an assumption from Mao that the primary contradiction is class struggle. But at that point, China is already free and has established a state. So the primary contradiction is not actually class struggle. The primary contradiction is that you don't have the productive forces in place to actually develop the country, defend the country against imperialism, develop the economy, support people, make sure no one's hungry. But also, in terms of the world, the primary contradiction isn't really class struggle alone. And Henry Winston says the contradiction is against imperialism. And the contradiction is there is an emerging crisis between war and humanity, or between war and peace. And so Henry Winston says that it doesn't really matter, even if you have something like the Sino-Soviet split, what is necessary is a united front for peace, not just for the world, but even for your own people to guarantee their development. So this is why Henry Winston, this is a lot of what Henry Winston says when he's talking about China's involvement in the African anti-colonial struggles, specifically in South Africa and also with the Portuguese colonies. Henry Winston, he also talks about the fallacy of what's known as Mao's three worlds theory. And the three worlds theory is, to Mao, the three worlds are one world is the US and the Soviet Union as imperialist forces, and he puts them together. The second world is countries like Europe, Japan, and then the third world is China, Asia, Africa. But putting the US and the Soviet Union together is the thing that Henry Winston really focuses on, and also asks us to actually fully understand. And I think it's important because actually if you think about today's moment, why else do you think that people are trying to equate what the US and China as imperialist forces, equal imperialist forces? And what Henry Winston says is you have to understand what the primary contradiction of the world is in order to understand who is on the side of the people, who is on the side of freedom, and then who is actually on the side of war and imperialism. And if you can understand that contradiction, then you can start to analyze which countries, which leaders are actually arguing for freedom versus going on the side of war. I also want to make a point about Du Bois, where to equate the US and the Soviet Union together is also completely ahistorical because Henry Winston makes this point. He says China, by doing that and also saying that the Soviet Union is imperialist and that China is different, it's ahistorical because China completely relied on the Soviet Union in order to free itself. But also it also goes against a vision for the future, which is Du Bois' vision, which is that there is one struggle, and it's a united struggle for human freedom, for self-determination. And it's a kind of struggle where you understand that the Russian Revolution is not separate from, but actually a precursor of the revolutions in China, in Vietnam, in Africa. And it's one world revolution for human freedom. And it's a type of revolution that brings you closer to the spirit and sacrifice of peoples around the world you may have never met. So I already touched on this, but I wanted to go over it again, that Henry Winston is super invaluable for understanding China, but also understanding our world today, because he walks through the specific ideological mistakes of Mao to understand what are the contradictions of the world. And he talks about, like, not just Maoists, but also a lot of American socialists, often the connection between the fact that Maoists and American socialists or European socialists will always assume everything should be reduced to class struggle alone, and why that's a mistake. And he says, despite the revolutionary image it presents to the world with assistance of the mass media of US imperialism, Maoist policy within China is reminiscent of the perennial policies of right-wing socialists in the US in relation to the oppression of black people. Like the Maoists in China, these right-wing socialists claim that the national struggle in the final analysis will be resolved, and therefore must await the unfolding of the class struggle. In the meantime, the right-wing socialists in the US and Europe continue to support the neo-colonialist policies of their respective bourgeoisies in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. And I thought that was a brilliant connection, because he's, the fact that he's connecting Maoists and American socialists together who believe things must wait for the class struggle, but also it's not a correct analysis of the actual issues that people face around the world, which is, like, first of all, class struggle cannot be separated from colonialism, imperialism, and race. But also it's the, like I mentioned before, it's an inaccurate analysis of the difference between, is the primary struggle class struggle, or is the primary struggle against war and imperialism? And I wanted to also bring up Martin Luther King, because actually if you think about it, Martin Luther King's speech against the Vietnam War, it's where he also makes the same point as Henry Winston, which is that the primary contradiction for China, for example, which internally is development and then internationally is imperialism, and they're interlinked, is also what Martin Luther King is also saying in his speech against the Vietnam War, where he understands the interlinked struggles against war, poverty, and racism. And that war abroad has imagined war against your own people. So in China, for example, the crime against the Chinese people, where the development is stunted because the Cultural Revolution focuses on class struggle or constant revolution, rather than focusing on how to develop the economy and make sure that the productive forces are in place for the people to be fed and housed. It matches China's policy abroad, where they were not on the side of peace. And so how is your development going to be protected if you don't have peace? And so you put your country on the side of imperialism under the guise of quote-unquote revolutionary, when you do not take the side of a United Front for Peace. And so what I wanted to say was the Cultural Revolution was not only a crime against the Chinese people, but humanity due to stagnated development domestically and the refusal to join the vanguard for peace, which would guarantee that domestic development. The last point that I think Winston makes that's very important is what you had mentioned, Doc, which is about strategy. And in Winston's analysis of Maoism and the issues with the Cultural Revolution for China's foreign policy, it goes against what should be a clear path to freedom. And I think Henry Winston is saying that the strategy for freedom has to be a united front against imperialism, which requires an interrelationship or a dialectic between the struggle for self-determination and a struggle for peaceful coexistence, or in other words, national liberation is interlinked with internationalism. And for us, the Free School has been studying democracy, and I think within self-determination, you see what Duboisian democracy, opportunity and a social contract with the state, where you know the state will actually provide for the people and represent the people in peace. But I think the interlinking of self-determination and the struggle for peaceful coexistence is important because of what I said before of things inside can also be seen outside. I think we can see in the US too, where war abroad can be seen internally as war against your own people when you have poverty and homelessness and drug addiction, no investment in schools, no investment in housing. And I think my last point is that this clarifies the struggle of our times as between war and humanity, not a reductive class struggle, which the Cultural Revolution was actually falsely based upon. Interestingly, Kim Il-sung of North Korea in 1966 agreed with Henry Winston, where he said, quote, "The basic strategy of the world revolution today is to direct its main spearhead against US imperialism. We must clearly distinguish a friend who has made an error from the foe. The foe should be attacked, but a friend who has made a mistake should be criticized and led back to the right path. We should in this way join efforts with all of our friends and fight the principal enemy." Continuing, and this is an important one, he says, quote, "US imperialist aggression in Vietnam is not only directed against the people of Vietnam, it is also an aggression against the socialist camp, a challenge to the national liberation movement, a threat to peace in Asia and the world." And I think this is important. What Kim Il-sung is saying is important because this is where China goes wrong. Kim Il-sung is saying the Vietnamese people's struggle is our struggle. And that's the interlinking of national liberation and internationalism. And this is also what led Du Bois to go to China and to know that what was happening in China when he visited was just as much as his own struggle and connected to the struggle of the American people. So how does this have to do with today's rise of China and how the American people and progressives around the world should view it? And this is the topic that I think Jahan will go into, but I'm really thankful for Henry Winston because I think the way he analyzes Maoism and what went wrong, I think it helps show us what side China is on today compared to what they were in the past. And the significance of Xi Jinping in both his domestic and foreign policies and the way they're connected. The fact that Xi Jinping and China, their focus is eliminating extreme poverty and soon poverty, but also their emphasis on development and peace and cooperation in Asia and Africa, including a very close relationship with Russia. And I'll end with Xi Jinping, a speech he gave at a conference on dialogue of Asian civilizations in 2019, which he titled "Deepening Exchanges and Mutual Learning Among Civilizations in Asian Community with a Shared Future." Quote, "Chinese civilization as an inclusive and integrated whole has become what it is today through constant interactions with other civilizations. It has been enriched by the introduction of Buddhism and the confluence of Islam and Confucianism in the old days, and by the introduction of Western learning, the launch of the new culture movement, and the introduction of Marxism and socialism in modern times." But even the title of his speech, where he talks about a shared future and community, it's funny because it's actually the opposite of a theory that Henry Winston really criticized of Mao, which is quote-unquote self-reliance. This idea that every country should be alone, and that Vietnam, a country like Vietnam, for example, should actually refuse aid from the Soviet Union because the Maoist theory is that your struggle is weakened if you have to rely on someone else, which again goes against even China's own revolution, where they received a lot of help from the Soviet Union. And it also was an excuse for China to not be involved in anything. So I think that's an interesting comparison, how much Xi Jinping today uses the opposite of self-reliance, which is cooperation, community,
shared development, and I think that's the end of my presentation, but I just want to thank also the organizers for this Henry Winston Symposium, for introducing me to Henry Winston, and for allowing me to better understand the Cultural Revolution in that moment in history through his brilliant framework and theoretical contributions.
Thank you very much, Emily, for laying that historical and ideological groundwork on which I'll try to build. My presentation will be concerned with China in the post-Mao period, and particularly in our time. But in order to do this, I think we do have to again return to history, which remains extremely important for understanding our era. Particularly in speaking of China and its relationship with Africa, we must begin with the very different historical relationship that China has shared with the African continent in comparison to the West. China has peaceful relationships of trade and cultural exchange with Africa on a civilization-to-civilization basis, which go back many, many centuries. One of the notable examples of this was the famous expedition of the Chinese Admiral Zhang He in medieval times, something which is still remembered very fondly in Africa's east coast. And it also indicated the fact that the Chinese were quite aware of Africa and had the resources to travel there on a regular basis. At the same time, we must never forget what W.E.B. Du Bois discusses in The World in Africa. That is the ways in which the West, and particularly the Western Industrial Revolution, which is the economic base of Western civilization, was built on a very different relationship with the African continent, based on plundering, on colonialism, and the transatlantic slave trade, which was all justified by the doctrine of white supremacy. Of course, the sins of this bear very heavily on the United States, something which the Black freedom struggle has long highlighted. During colonialism, Western missionary projects, working alongside the colonizers, formed the initial basis for concepts of aid and charity, which continue to basically serve as the basis of much of ideas of development and aid today. This is in contrast to the preferred term in China, which is cooperation with Africa, cooperation between developing countries. And again, it is important to remember that China, although it had this very impressive naval reach and knew all these shipping routes and had a very powerful army, never colonized a single country in Africa, nor did it base its economy, which at one point was one of the world's two largest, along with India, before the age of colonialism, on trade in black skins, unlike the West. Much to the opposite, China shares with Africa a history of colonial subjugation, beginning with the Opium Wars to the 100 Years of Humiliation, and then the carving up of the Middle Kingdom by Western powers for spheres of influence, including, again, the United States. Of course, both also share a history of anti-colonial revolution. Emily spoke at length about some of the contradictions and the negative sides of the Mao period, but it is also important to remember that China and Africa established diplomatic relations soon after the victory of the People's Republic, at least with those African nations which were independent. There were diplomatic exchanges, and at that time, China began these projects of cooperation, some of which actually initially were quite useful. For example, early projects of industrialization in places like Ghana and Guinea. Particularly in the period between the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution, in which Mao was kind of on the back foot. That was the time in which Zhou Enlai made a very famous expedition across, not an expedition, but a diplomatic tour across Africa, and won a lot of goodwill in the newly independent African nations, and in which a lot of these projects were inaugurated.
Unfortunately, again, as Emily discussed, the Cultural Revolution added a lot of unnecessary layers to these projects, particularly the ultra-leftism, the sectarianism, and the attempt to export the ideology of Maoism in these countries. And I won't go into detail about that. Emily covered that quite well. But I will return to how that has shifted in the post-Mao period. But before I do that, I would also like to say that we have to look at another more recent history, which is understanding, in order to understand the significance of Chinese engagement with Africa in the past few decades, we have to understand the significance of what the West has done in this period so that we have a useful contrast. So it's important to remember that in the early decades of African nations' independence, from about the 1950s to the late 1970s, these African states, along with much of the Third World, experienced steady industrial and agricultural growth. Some did this by embarking on a socialist development model, and others by taking advantage of the competition between the rival blocs in the Cold War. In fact, in this time, the West in some ways was on the back foot because in order to compete with the Soviet Union, it had to offer attractive terms of aid and development. So though poor and beset by the immense problems inherited by colonialism, newly independent African nations built infrastructure, often through aid and assistance by the superpowers, as well as built industry, began to modernize agriculture in order to improve food production in societies that had been reduced to frequent famines by colonialism, and also embarked on ambitious expansions of public education in order to build a modern workforce. The resource-rich African nations, however, were largely economically dependent on the export of raw materials to the wealthy First World in order to earn revenue in which they could reinvest in these projects of upliftment. Despite the West's hunger for these materials, Western nations in this period coordinated with each other to keep the buying prices of materials low, effectively adopting a policy of neo-colonialism in their dealings with the continent. In addition, many African nations required loans from the IMF or World Bank because they were starved of capital, again because of the legacy of colonialism, to finance these modernization projects. It's also more important to remember the Bretton Woods system created after World War II forced them to rely on the US dollar, largely, to conduct trade in many international markets. Despite these challenges, the political and economic support of the Socialist bloc, led by the USSR, as well as coordination with the rest of the Third World in the form of the non-aligned movement, led these confident African states to not only make initial gains in development, but also to begin to challenge the West's domination of these commodity markets of raw materials, and the West's stranglehold on global capital needed for further development. And some of these initiatives were talked about in the previous panel, particularly the struggle for the new international economic order, to radically restructure the terms of trade, the power of multinational corporations, and the right to control natural resources. These were championed by the Socialist bloc in the Third World, and even passed by large margins in the United Nations. However, in this period, the West, and this is again, we're talking about the new international economic order was passed in the 1970s. The West, led by the United States, fresh off of the humiliating and very costly defeat in Vietnam, facing economic recession and unrest at home, feared this growing unity and strength, and so went on an extreme counteroffensive. And I think this is something which Henry Winston noted. I know Doc has talked about Henry Winston's view that imperialism, after being defeated in Vietnam, had set its sights very much on the African continent. And just looking at some of the pamphlets which are curated in the exhibition, many of them are talking about imperialism, the strategy in Africa. So in addition to utilizing coup d'etats and military pressure, the US began to weaponize its control over money supply by myriad financial measures, including the Federal Reserve's manipulation of interest rates and harsher terms of loans and trade with the Third World. hyperinflation and other economic contradictions which the US was facing, again because of what had happened in Vietnam and the contradictions of the capitalist model, were in effect offsetted to the third world itself. And I mean, again, it's important to remember that in the period in which these decisions were taken, in the mid to late 1970s, if you had been alive, and I think we have some people who were there, I was putting myself in the shoes of someone then. The important point I want to make is that it looked as if the progressive forces were on the ascendant. It looked as if imperialism was really threatened because of these economic contradictions and because of these victories, these revolutions, this growing unity. And so it was very precisely this which the West sought to undermine, both physically and through the manipulation of finances and financial markets. These contradictions were basically offsetted to the third world. The inflation and these other measures led to manipulations in the dollar and basically what's known as the third world debt crisis, which heavily affected Africa, which could because high inflation led to a situation in which loans which were taken now cost exponentially more, and the money which was earned on exports became exponentially less. So in order to deal with this situation, there was a conference in 1980 in Lagos, Nigeria, in which African leaders and thinkers gathered to formulate what was known as the Lagos Plan of Action, which again condemned imperialism as responsible for this debt crisis. But in response, the IMF and the World Bank developed the idea of the structural adjustment policy. This was in effect a policy by which countries which were facing hardships due to loans and inflation or other payment commitments would only receive relief if they adopted a strict policy of deregulation, privatization, and abandonment of any social welfare. In effect, this meant that independent African states had to capitulate to the West's directions on how to run a financial system, and in effect how to run their state as a whole. Thus was born what became known as neoliberalism. It's important to remember, because the Western left often talks about neoliberalism as simply a domestic policy, something that had to do with merely domestic concerns. But it's important to remember this was born in the context of imperialism and neocolonialism in an attempt to strangle the third world states. In time, this imperialist construction of neoliberalism would become known as the Washington Consensus on Development, which is basically would become in academia and elsewhere the main paradigm for how the third world should develop. Of course, in Africa, this had very severe consequences. Whereas the 1960s and 70s were decades of development, the 1980s would come to be known as the lost decade as far as economic growth. This trend was only exacerbated by the collapse of the USSR and the Eastern European Socialist bloc in the 1990s. In effect, Africa experienced severe deindustrialization, with many African nations losing the progress they made in building industries and becoming economies solely built for export of raw materials in this period. Similarly, countries with rich agricultural lands, which had been exporters of food grain, became net importers, struggling again to feed their populations. A continent which had experienced stirrings of freedom, dignity, and self-sufficiency became the poster child for poverty and hunger. While before, Washington and institutions such as the World Bank had been forced to offer constructive aid packages and build infrastructure, of course infrastructure being very important for development, which the Washington Consensus attempts to negate, arguing that infrastructure is not important. While they had previously been forced to offer these things to compete with the USSR, now the predatory Washington Consensus became the only consensus on offer to most of the third world. African states deeply indebted to the West were deeply indebted to the West, and the functions of their states were totally hollowed out. It's important to note that along with this neoliberal economic and political consensus came new social theories heavily influenced by postmodernism, which, no coincidence, attacked the state, regardless of whether the state was socialist or capitalist or colonial or anti-colonial, as being an inherently oppressive institution. Thus, independent states were weakened from within and attacked from without ideologically, at times even physically. It was argued real development or growth can come not from state-led policy, but from non-governmental organizations whose well-paid experts were linked to the powerful Western imperialist states, or from the benevolent guidance of socially responsible multinational corporations. And at the same time, these myths were propagated that Africa's problems, Africa's poverty and lack of growth was not due to any of this history, which I've tried to outline, but because of these ideas that African leaders are inherently corrupt. Africa has problems like tribalism, authoritarianism, intractable conflicts. A few people still try to bring in other things about the role of the weather on people's moods, things like that, all kinds of essentially neo-racist theories. So thus it's important to remember that the West's crimes against Africa are on multiple counts. First is the transatlantic slave trade, then is colonialism, and then this new wave of neo-colonialism through policies of war as well as financial manipulation to keep the African masses under tight control. So now that I've laid that out to some degree, now returning to the People's Republic of China in this period, the period post-Mao, we must consider what has happened. So as some of you know, Deng Xiaoping, the leader after Mao, developed a creative synthesis of market socialism and reform and opening up, in which the strong Chinese state was able to bargain with Western capital on fair terms. What Deng described as biding its time and hiding its strength, China was given space to experiment with different policies to stir economic growth, industrialization, and modernization. A great deal of infrastructure was built, a great deal of joint projects of industry were developed, a great deal of technical know-how was shared between China and the West. An important thing to note is that much of this occurred in deals that the Chinese government made with Western corporations or Western nations, in which these Western states or companies were given Chinese raw materials or Chinese commodities in exchange for financing infrastructure or industrial units within China. That's an important point, which relates to China's relationship with Africa. But throughout all this, the political system remained strongly independent, with China's leadership working in favor of the Chinese masses rather than the concerns of neo-colonialism in China. And at the same time, under Deng Xiaoping and under other leaders after him, the Chinese policy towards Africa was shifted away from the ideological export of revolution, more to a policy of non-interference, economic cooperation, and that sort of thing. So just as the West was under illusions about China playing into its hands during this period of cooperation, as we've discussed before, much of the West thought that it was inevitable that all this economic cooperation and development would lead China to become like the West, and was something totally misread. The West totally misread Deng's policy of biding time and hiding strength, and thought it was a capitulation to neoliberalism. I would argue at the same time that the Western elite have severely underestimated the significance of China's engagement with Africa, particularly in the past 30 years. This is something which Western elites have only now begun to rectify, which is the reason for hysterical and extremely hypocritical headlines about China's supposed dead-trap diplomacy and recolonizing of Africa. That's come from the mainstream historical press, but if you listen to the more intelligent Western experts looking at Chinese engagement over the past 30 years with the Third World and with Africa in particular, the more intelligent have begun to talk about this engagement producing a Beijing consensus on development that has begun to rival the Washington consensus. Let's to get into some of the differences between these two, where the Washington consensus has attacked the role of states in terms of driving the economy in favor of free market fundamentalism, the Beijing consensus has encouraged a strong role for the state to shape the direction of the economy, where the Washington consensus offers loans and aid under strict conditions in the name of accountability and human rights, which in reality are about enforcing Western political interests and ideas on African states. Beijing largely offers what are known as soft loans, which are loans on concessionary terms, without any political conditions, save for committing to the One China policy, which means, recognizing the People's Republic rather than Taiwan. And even that, there are some cases in which China has made very large economic agreements with countries which still recognize Taiwan. Whereas the West discourages long-term planning and economic thinking, Beijing encourages long-term partnerships with states, nudging these states towards involving planning in their economies. Now, another crucial thing to keep in mind is the role of finance capital in the West. Western imperialism is driven by the concerns of finance capital in Wall Street, the City of London, among other places, to earn short-term profits and engage in rampant speculation, which is essentially the driving force behind the West's relationship with Africa today. In contrast, the People's Republic of China bans large private commercial banks. China's financial sector consists of several very large, publicly controlled banks, which are totally under the control of the CPC and the Chinese state and play a major role in the nation's 5-year plan. Currently, 3 of these very large banks are dedicated exclusively to international partnerships. Chinese banks play a unique role in the model of market socialism, investing in both the public and private sector and for targeted poverty alleviation. These unique institutions have played a major role in eliminating poverty within China, and the fact that the Chinese economy is driven by the people's state with the people's bank rather than finance capital, contrasted distinctly from the Leninist model of imperialism which the United States and the West embody. And this is a key point. Lenin talked about imperialism as driven by finance capital. It's a stage of capitalism driven by finance capital. And in short, it's important to remember that he understood imperialism as a system, not as a particular policy of a particular state. Whereas Lenin emphasized finance capital in terms of a political economy, again, looking from a Du Boisian perspective, of course, is also the role of the color line. The West embodies both. Relationship with Africa driven by the needs of finance capital, as well as the imperatives of the color line, which is, I would argue, in great contrast to China's engagement with Africa, which we can get more into. And so I think this is clear upon close examination of how the West and China are dealing with African states, where the West emphasizes the trade in raw materials for short-term profit as well as reckless financial speculation. China, particularly in the past 15 years, has focused on partnerships that could transform African states from merely raw material exporters to industrialized nations. Based on a philosophy of win-win cooperation, China offers aid for massive infrastructure and industrialization projects, which can be paid for in exchange for raw materials, while the West prefers to pay off a few African hands for natural resources. The Chinese financial system creates conditions for a long-term partnership of development. The Chinese model allows for this to be planned with partnering countries. Similarly, the Chinese model allows for a large ecosystem of Chinese public, private, commercial engagement in Africa to be coordinated with aid, soft loans, grants, and technical and educational cooperation over many years. And again, I want to re-emphasize the point that much of this is informed by China's own experience in development, because many of these deals which are made are very similar to the deals which the Chinese government had previously made on favorable terms with the outside world. So through these projects, African countries have begun to make gains in reindustrializing. For instance, countries such as Zambia are moving from merely exporting raw coal to gaining the facilities to process coal, or Ethiopia from simply exporting cotton to building textile factories with Chinese partnerships, or Ghana from being an exporter of crude oil to building an oil processing facility with Chinese assistance. And it's important to note that this is significant because being able to process these goods puts these countries at an advantage, both in terms of they can sell these exports at higher rates, but also it helps improve the conditions for sovereignty, because there are many countries in the third world which, for example, export crude oil, but they are not able to use oil to fuel their own economies, because you need to be able to process that oil, and the West maintains a monopoly on these facilities. Similar with coal, and similar with textiles in order to clothe your population, and in other fields also, for example, pharmaceuticals, which are very important as well. At an even more basic level, Chinese partnerships have also allowed for raw material exports to pay for infrastructure projects such as road, railway networks, and electricity production. The latter is especially dire need in Africa, because due to things such as World Bank privatization policies and the overall legacy of underdevelopment, 500 million people out of 1.2 billion in Africa have no electricity. And it's important to notice that the ones that do have electricity do not necessarily even have it 24 hours a day. This is despite the fact that a country such as Niger produces uranium, which is used for nuclear energy, as well as produces nearly 1/3 of exports the materials for nearly 1/3 of France's light bulbs. Similarly, the problem of food, which I talked about earlier. China has realized with its own growth and growing and healthy population, it needs to grow more food, more than it can grow on its own soil. The Chinese leadership also realizes that this large demand for Chinese food could have a negative effect on the world by raising food prices, which would doubly stress places in Africa, which already are dealing with food shortages, and because of rising demand in China, food prices rising would make the situation even worse. So China has embarked on a partnership to expand agriculture in African nations in order to move to a period in which Africa can both feed itself and return to its status as a grain exporter, as it has in the past. And we can get more into that as well. Nonetheless, the West is naturally very unhappy about this. The Western media is on a frenzy, speaking of African nations defaulting on Chinese debt. But it's important to note that according to my research and anything I could find, so far not a single nation has defaulted on Chinese debt. For that matter, no nation in the entire third world, from what I can find, has defaulted on Chinese debt, whereas many countries have defaulted on Western loans in the past. And it's important to note a default is when you cannot pay a loan and in which you have to give up your sovereign resources to a country. What has happened, and I can get into the details of this in the Q&A if anyone would like, what has happened has been financial renegotiations between African states and China. For example, when projects are behind schedule, when states are stressed for other reasons, but the Western media will spin it and say, oh, that's a default. But it's not a default, it's a renegotiation. And in fact, there is nearly every African country, and for that matter, nearly every country in the third world, is heavily indebted to the West, not to China. The highest proportions I've seen of Chinese debt in Africa are about 30%, and it's a high level. Most are much lower, and have been steadily paying off the loans, because again, they're based on these long-term deals about raw materials, paying for infrastructure, and so naturally the Chinese are also incentivized to help them pay this off in order to move on to the next stage of their partnerships. And of course, these are all already producing material gains. In fact, the Chinese socialized banking model allows for the funding of projects which Western commercial banks and even organizations like the IMF or World Bank consider too high risk, which in Africa covers a wide gamut of essential infrastructure. For example, the building of large railways in East Africa, the World Bank and IMF, they all would say it's too high risk, there's no guarantee of returns, but that's because they need quick returns. Whereas the Chinese model is what Western academics have called patient capital. But essentially it's because the socialized model, they don't need immediate returns, they can wait. Certainly Chinese projects have not been perfect, particularly when it comes to private Chinese companies employing African laborers. The fact that there are 54 African countries in a vast continent with over 1 billion people means there are bound to be incidents of mistreatment, problems, which are often sensationalized by the Western press and social media companies. Though our media does not tell us, for instance, that the PRC often takes steps to punish its own citizens for such instances. Most recently, an example in the Congo, in which documentary films were made about companies doing illegal mining in the Congo. One film was made about an American company doing illegal mining, something which American companies have been doing for many decades, and even at times the governments have taken issue with that, but there have been no consequences. But in contrast, when a Chinese company was exposed for doing illegal mining, the Chinese government actually took action against that Chinese company and said they would support whatever action the Congolese authorities choose to take against that particular company. And again, this is a private company, not a state-owned company. That's just one example. We must be clear that these Chinese projects in Africa, though they may contain certain contradictions, are not fundamentally antagonistic to the African masses in the way Western imperialism is. That is to say, Western imperialism has built itself on and continues to thrive on the exploitation of African labor, finances, and natural resources. It seeks to weaken and, when possible, even destroy African states and institutions. And so it is no surprise that the founding of the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation in 2006 was followed soon after, 1 year later, by the founding of the U.S. Army Africa Command, or that in this young century, the U.S. has committed crimes on Africa, such as the destruction of Muammar Gaddafi's Libya, Africa's most developed state, which has spread ISIS and other forms of extremism throughout the Sahel region. In contrast, China's actions in Africa this century have been to fund the construction of the African Union headquarters as a gift to African unity, support projects for public health, as well as regional integration, or that more African students are studying in China on scholarships than in the US or in Europe. So though this situation may appear at times on the surface to be complex and at times contradictory, I would argue Chinese policy in Africa is severely undermining imperialism's hold on the continent. It is providing not just an economic and financial, but also a political and ideological alternative to the Western model, something which cannot be, in my view, underestimated. Long-term partnerships with great socialist economic power are nudging states, even those which have been constructed by the West as client states or face severe internal weaknesses, into the direction of long-term planning and socialism. Countries which earn revenue largely through the export of raw materials are becoming slowly industrialized. A continent purposely divided and disconnected is becoming connected through roads and trains, as well as communications infrastructure through companies such as Huawei. Neo-colonial education in the West, for Africans in the West, is being challenged by Chinese educational institutions. As Du Bois predicted so long ago, Africa is beginning, at least, to unite with its rightful partner in Asia. For us in the West, we must fight for the right of Africa's self-determination, which must include the right for African states and peoples to determine their own relations with China. The West, and particularly this new Biden administration, although it's been going on for several administrations, is very much pressuring African states to break off ties with China, to not participate in economic cooperation, and to not participate in the Belt and Road Initiative. In contrast, China is not making the same demands on African states. That's why it's not telling African states to break off their economic or political relationships with America, or for that matter, any other country. US AFRICOM means that there is a US military presence in nearly every African nation, whereas China is military present only in one African nation, the East African nation of Djibouti. And that too is under a UN anti-piracy mandate for pirates which have been operating in the Indian Ocean and the Persian Gulf. The West claims the right to instruct Africans on how to deal with China, where it lacks any moral authority to do so until reparations and redress are given for slavery and colonialism. We are now in a period in which Africa, together with China, can find what Winston cited Emile Cabral as saying calling its historical associates. And I would include in this not just China, but the entire rising continent of Asia, the multipolar world, including nations such as Russia and Iran. Possibilities previously unimagined for humanity are on the table if only the warmongers and profiteers in our country can be stopped from their projects of destruction. A correct analysis and unity of all progressive people can once and for all undermine the destructive system of imperialism and lead to what President Xi has called for win-win cooperation, unity, peace, and development, and as Emily said, a shared community for the future of mankind. Thank you.
So, we'll do a short question and discussion section.
Okay, and I guess it's like something that you guys would say to the younger generation. In terms of this question of democracy, and also in view of the Biden administration, what does it mean to assess China in terms of Winston as opposed to Biden?
Yeah, I would reiterate what I just said. I think it is very important the fact that the contrasting relationships between the U.S. and China and Africa, or we can expand that to the third world in general. One side, the U.S. feels it's entitled to run the affairs of Africa, feels it's entitled to dictate the political systems, the economic systems, feels that it's a superior society, again going back to that missionary aid model, obviously the legacy of white supremacy. The other side is talking about cooperation, and is not talking about dictating terms of political systems or participating in sanctions or controlling countries' currencies, supplies, any of that stuff. In fact, is working with countries which historically have been totally opposed politically to it or have totally different models. And so, I think that draws a clear distinction in my view. And as far as the youth, I would say that it's very important not to trust the headlines of the Western media, as Winston would, look into doing research and reading material out there. And because the great mistake, again, is to allow the ruling class to define what these terms mean. Allow the ruling class to define what debt trap diplomacy is, what neocolonialism is, to allow the ruling class to define for the American people, or for any people in the world, who their enemy is and who their friends are.
I'll just go quickly because we have a lot of questions, but yeah, I also think the other thing is, reading Henry Winston was such a gift too, because he was so just excited about every people's struggle, and in particular in Africa, and what that can also teach himself, the Communist Party, young people on how to fulfill the American Revolution, and fulfill American democracy. And so I think, I know it sounds basic, but Henry Winston would view China with the lens of wanting to learn from what's happening there and what that would mean for America. Whereas, Biden, it's much more, I feel like we would know, but Biden, it would not be the US, the American people we're encouraged to think the American people have nothing in common with the Chinese people. And it's the opposite with Henry Winston, where it's always looking for, what can we learn, what do we have in common, but then, I think Henry Winston was saying, at what point does the government actually betray the people's struggle?
First, congrats on organizing this conference. Perfect involved. It's very successful. I have a question going to, Joe's presentation about, you brought up that imperialism is not a policy, so my question is sort of what does it mean to overcome imperialism? So Lenin kind of described it as the overripeness of the need for revolution had grown ripe and then become rotten, right? Just to complete the analogy. And so in that sense, it would seem like it can't be a policy. So even when people try to scale back on imperialist policies, so Trump tried to reduce military bases, but in order to do so, he had to increase the military budget because he had to pay off the state. So what do you see then as the way to overcome imperialism if it's not like a policy, but rather something that I would say is a crisis, right, to come with crisis? And thank you, and congrats.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, and I think a very multifaceted one. I would begin to answer that by saying, of course, ultimately the most important task is to overcome imperialism lays in the hands of the people of the United States, to challenge their own ruling elite, to challenge the institutions of the society and the state, to transform the state, as it were, away from being an imperialist state and the economic system from being an imperialist one to becoming a system of the people and one that seeks principled relationships with the peoples of the world. But that being said, of course, the world is moving forward regardless of what's happening here. And I think that what we're seeing now is, after about 30 years of this unipolar world, of this Washington consensus dominating the world, we are seeing breaks, in the system, and of course, the rise of China is a very important part of this. You're seeing states in Africa, as well as in Asia, as well as in South America, Latin America as a whole, again having possibilities before them that they never did for development, for infrastructure, for even nationalization of resources. Of just the ability to resist imperialism, at least imperialist aggressions. And those help give us direction and provide a basis on which the American people can ultimately join a great front against, to overcome imperialism and for positive peace. So I think in that sense, these are all very positive developments. So that's what I would say in part to answer your question.
Emily, you spoke about the connection Henry Winston made between the Maoist sort of extreme leftist thought and the isolationist tendencies of the American socialism, which makes me think of this American exceptionalist idea. How where do you think these ideas stem from, and how was it that China was able to overcome these ideas from this Maoist line to this more multipolar, win-win cooperation basis? And then another question I have is, how do you respond to the current American exceptionalist, like democratic socialists, who say that we need to follow a more Scandinavian model like Denmark? Which I just want to say Denmark is one of the largest exporters of gold and doesn't have a single gold mine.
Okay, maybe I'll answer first and let John answer the second question about democratic socialists. Well, I think that was the interesting thing about the question of where did the ultra-leftist theories and policies come from. It was interesting because when I was reading Henry Winston's book, he talks about how actually it was a betrayal of the Chinese people. Because actually, historically, and Mao himself actually says this, where in 1949, earlier, and then also Song Qingling, who's the honorary chairman of the People's Republic, when she accepts the multiple Stalin Peace Prizes she receives on behalf of China, they actually all take the line that Henry Winston is taking and the Soviet Union is taking, which is that you need a united front for peace, and you need a united front against imperialism. And it's based, even this really important interlinking or dialectic between national liberation goes hand in hand with internationalism, or like the United Front. Like they have to go hand in hand if humanity ever wants to be free. I think, this isn't quite an answer. I don't know exactly where it comes from. I think it, maybe a combination of some egoism, a combination of like Mao himself, his changing ideology. I think there's many factors, but I do think the important thing that Henry Winston mentions over and over is he says it goes against actually what the Chinese people and the party leadership were actually standing for. That actually the party leadership and the Chinese people were pro-United Front with the Soviet Union, especially as the US is escalating aggression in Vietnam. So I don't know if that completely answers your question, but I don't think isolationism is actually I don't really know how natural it is, but I also think that's why it's significant that Xi Jinping, when he talks about future, whether it's RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, or other types of partnerships with, whether it's Russia or Asian countries or with Africa, or even when he talks about renewing the Bandung spirit in today's times, he's actually always going back to civilization. And I think that's important because he's talking about something almost fundamental or philosophical about each civilization benefits from the kind of sharing, the cooperation, the respect, and he's trying to pull upon something that's ancient and historical in China's history, rather than letting the party, the people, the future be defined by this certain period. In some ways you could call it an aberration. What happened with the Cultural Revolution and what China did with its foreign policy. Well, I'll let John answer about democratic socialists.
Yeah, just quickly, I wanted to say why I would say that the problem is how we define democracy and the need to define it and not allow the ruling class to define it. But one quick interesting thing is that the Democratic Socialists of America was actually formed through a merger of this organization called the Democratic Socialist Organizing Committee, which was a social democratic organization, and a Maoist group called the New America Movement in the early 1980s. They merged to form the DSA. So an interesting link between DSA and Maoist. But yeah.
Thank you both very much for the wonderful historical account. I want to pick up on Emily's, again, amazing discussion on the Sino-Soviet split and Winston's critique of Maoism. And you guys talked about it this summer, and I was there. The funny thing is, both Mao and Khrushchev called each other revisionists. China and the Soviet Union call each other revisionists. And you brought up that Winston's critique that it's an ideological mistake, and the era of the three worlds theory, right? And I think that critique largely is also a critique of Maoism by official communism. And so I wonder if it is possible that the Chinese leadership and Mao make every decision correctly, but there still will be this crisis in world communism. Or in other words, are these subjective errors, subjective factors, perhaps themselves product of something that has deeper roots?
Interesting.
Okay. Well, yeah, it's also a very interesting historical question. I think generally trying to understand history, this is one of the main challenges, is trying to see what is objective and what is subjective. In other words, what was, in a particular historical moment, what were the things which were inherited by the people living in that time that shaped the events of their time versus what was shaped by their own decisions. And I can begin to attempt to take a crack at that, and I think that, I personally, especially based on what Emily said, I do think that the Sino-Soviet split, especially the way in which it happened, and the negative consequences. I think that could have been perhaps avoided if maybe both sides, but particularly the Chinese side, had taken more conciliatory positions. And certainly, I think there were people in China who were advocating for that, and there were even people probably in the Soviet Union and other countries too that were definitely in other countries like Kim Il-sung, Fidel Castro, who were also advocating more conciliation because of the greater problems or the greater need for unity against imperialism. But of course, I know from a little bit of knowing the history of Russia and China, there are, naturally when you have two neighboring countries, especially ones that are very large and been neighbors for a long time, there are problems, disagreements about whose territory belongs to who, about culture, maybe perhaps there's both cultural collaboration and exchange and there's conflict. But I think it's a question of how do people work with those things, do people develop an ideology which emphasizes the cooperation, the collaboration, the greater placing their civilizations in the context of what's happening in the world in terms of imperialism, in terms of the need for humanity to move forward. And clearly the fact that, although of course Russia is no longer ruled by a communist party, but the fact that now both leaderships of Russia and China are very strongly allied with each other. And it's not merely, I think, about, part of it is, of course, the common political interest, but I think from what I read, also a lot of cultural, connections. Basically this thing of civilization connecting them. And that's one of, today's panel is about China and Africa, but when you talk about China and Asia, and particularly what's called Eurasia, that's, I think, a very, very positive development that all these countries neighbors are cooperating with each other, are integrating through these infrastructure projects, also politically through these regional organizations and through the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. So anyway, that's what I'm doing.
Yeah, I think what you were saying about Russia today, it's the Xi Jinping quote is from, that I read, is from what's known as, it's like a new thing called the Conference of Dialogue of Asian Civilizations, which interestingly includes Russia. And I don't know, I think and actually their second meeting is going to happen in 2022 to coincide with like a big resolution the Communist Party of China is going to release next year on foreign policy, which I think will be really interesting. But I think I wanted to just emphasize what Jahan had said about choice. It's like every country, different countries will have different differences, ancient like border disputes, territorial disputes. But the reason why I really liked and I quoted, it may have seemed kind of like included out of nowhere, but the reason why I read the quotes from Kim Il-sung are because that whole speech is about the choice you make. What kind of ideology will your country take? Korea is kind of sandwiched between the Soviet Union and China at that time, but Kim Il-sung he's saying that whole thing about friends or foes, but if you're friends as in partners against imperialism, you're going to have differences, but will your ideology lead you to a united front for peace, or are you going to criticize their domestic policy, call them revisionists, whatnot? And yeah, I will say that 1966 speech by Kim Il-sung to the Second Congress of North Korea I really recommend reading it actually. Just in terms of his philosophy, but also strategy for how he says that not just the socialist camp, but any progressive country with masses of people behind it, how they should approach each other and try to take down imperialism together.
So in the interest of time, we're going to move on to our next panel, but I do think these ideas will come up throughout the conference, so hopefully we can discuss more. But thank you, Emily and John, for your presentations. For this panel is entitled Winston and King, Civil Rights and Peace. So I welcome Mrs. Catherine Blunt and Emile Pommier up to present.
talk today about the connection between Henry Winston's thought and the thought of Martin Luther King Jr. And its relationship with civil rights and peace. I'm titling this talk that I'm giving is America's Essence, Winston King and Our Democratic Struggle for Peace. The ruling narrative in America today is that the essence of democracy is individual freedom from any social responsibilities. Civil rights is the ability to put one's own identity and self-interest above a broader concern for humanity as a whole. This removes civil rights from its relationship to peace and democracy from the question of poverty. To see our common future, this rupture needs to be understood, no matter how uncomfortable that conversation might be. In a society divided by ruling institutions and their self-defined solutions, unity requires non-conformity to ruling interpretation. Unity demands us seek out the truth from wherever it might bear fruit. Unity requires us to delve into that painful, shared history, which we are assured is of no value. For there have always been those willing to risk the depths of despair to shine a light towards the future. Thinkers who were not limited to the ruling voices of their time and moved to a higher calling in the uplift of their people. To be true to that great striving for unity, we look to the great democratic legacies of Henry Winston, Martin Luther King Jr., and the movements they embodied. We must study their work to rekindle that flame of struggle by which our humanity depends. We think of Martin Luther King Jr. as well known. Many of us realize the sanitized version of King is not the full picture, but still, we make the error of treating King as naive or tragically misguided. His true legacy has been co-opted by corporate interests and confused by today's radical, self-righteous youth. Henry Winston, on the other hand, is a name none of us are taught in school. Although his body of work mirrors King, and his struggle was a prelude to the civil rights period, his life has been removed from our collective consciousness. Winston's connection to the Communist Party made him intolerable to the dogmatic views of U.S. ruling institutions. The essence of his ideas were rooted in elevating the consciousness of the masses towards their rightful desire for peace. This vision bound these two luminaries together with the lot of the voiceless in society. It put them in the crosshairs of the class forces committed to holding working people back to the pre-civil rights era of struggle. Through the use of academia and mass media, this elite class has shown a determined interest in separating us from their ideas. In the face of a society driven blind from war, King reminded us of our moral responsibility to speak up when injustice demanded silence. He illuminated how the ills endured by this society are a direct consequence of our government's insatiable drive to war. This interconnection between war, racism, and poverty in our society provides us with a deeper understanding of our current crisis. King also stressed the need for moral clarity in order to develop a principled unity among the people. When he was confronted with the notion that he remained focused solely on civil rights, King rejected such divisions and struggle and emphasized the importance of a commitment to all humanity. In his famous speech, Beyond Vietnam, A Time to Break Silence, King said, quote, "We are called to speak for the weak, for the voiceless, for the victims of our nation, and for those it calls enemy. For no document from human hands can make these humans any less our brothers." Winston saw these ideas as crucial for raising the consciousness of the people. He believed that democracy was the most effective means by which the people of this nation could advance towards socialism. He saw democracy not only in procedural terms, but in its relationship to a higher life of the people it serves. Confronted with the question of applying Soviet theory to the West, Winston said, quote, "We drink from the fountain of knowledge from whatever source, and use it for social advance. This is the case in natural sciences. Why should it be the case in social science? Winston saw the work of social progress as a scientific endeavor that was best understood through the social theories of Marxist Leninism. His books focused on the many ways in which working people and their revolutionary movements, like the Black freedom struggle, are distorted, how they are blunted and used as tools to develop a monopoly class, maintain its rule. In misinterpreting these struggles, Winston believed we are led to aggravate the very issues we seek to solve. Winston stressed the inseparable role race and class played in understanding our social woes. It is through this lens that we must revisit our nation's legacy of struggle. We are told the civil rights movement had more to do with diversity for individuals than universal social demands. The fight was simply about inclusion for people of color into an overall just and civil society. That this society always skewed who was considered human by their enforced economic position was not considered relevant. This narrow view of civil rights loses sight of the ultimate aims of the Black freedom struggle. Shortly before his death, King said, quote, "I fear I am integrating my people into a burning house." To this idea, he stressed we become firemen and said, quote, "Until we commit ourselves to ensuring the underclass is given justice and opportunity, we will continue to perpetuate the anger and violence that tears at the soul of this nation." King saw integration as a necessary means to progress towards the real goal of social, political, and economic equality. All of the struggles Henry Winston participated in have been removed of their ideological content as well. From the struggle to organize the unemployed, the fight for integration, for a living wage, to even the war against fascism, we are assured these developments are completely unrelated to the communist movements of that time. The trial in which Winston and 10 other members of the Communist Party were wrongly convicted is hardly discussed to this day, despite the fact that this country recently had a parallel show trial in which the former president was accused of being an agent of a foreign government. This slander of treason was used against Winston in the Smith Act trials and has been used to endanger and destroy the lives of thousands of American citizens throughout the United States. These distorted versions of history lead us to false and ultimately selfish solutions. The current academic notion of how to fight racism is to successfully pass liberal reform through the Democratic Party to support anti-racist policies. This view of racism separates it from what Winston would call its class origins. He saw racism as a social phenomenon based on historic developments in class struggle. A fight Winston stressed must never be denied. In Strategy for a Black Agenda, Winston writes, quote, "To carry out this legacy in the United States calls for challenging the quasi-intellectuals and pseudo-revolutionaries who would have us abandon the struggle by denying the class basis of racism. Fighting racism, expecting liberation, is inconceivable without a strategy directed against the class source of racism." Today, Western media recommends another solution to racism: buy Black merchandise, watch Black Marvel films, support more Black-owned private businesses. This separates racism from its relationship as a link between war and poverty. These prescribed antidotes have led us down a path of declaring changes in the names and language of problems as progressive. These solutions in name only are what Henry Winston referred to as tokenist reformism. He stressed that these supposed solutions cloak and distort the real conflict, a fight which has a class force invested in maintaining that inequality. As a result, we are led to believe that racism is a personal question with individualist answers. These answers come from a value system that is not of our own community's teachings. They are what Winston called the values of division, and they are extremely effective in doing precisely that. Instead of seeing hardworking white men and women as our natural allies, we are told their struggle isn't real and their minds are backward. Worse yet, they have been given the blame for all our societal woes. Does this remind us of another time in history? It's not the intelligence community who is at fault, nor Wall Street, nor Google,
nor the weapons firms who profit most from bombs dropped on the darker peoples of the world. No, it's your uncle who voted for Trump. It's your school's janitor who doesn't understand your pronouns. They are condemned in our academies as the bearers of white privilege and scorned for their supposed monolithic history of settler colonialism. We are to believe somehow that white people have never been victims of this society, nor have ever fought alongside blacks for equality. It's as if the examples of Lucretia Mott, Elias Hicks, Francis Pastorius, and John Brown never existed. Martin Luther King himself said there are twice as many whites as blacks, and as such, didn't see any legitimate reason to separate the march against poverty between them. Instead, King called on us to develop an overriding loyalty to mankind as a whole, to develop a broad movement of anti-war, anti-poverty, and anti-monopoly coalition. In the current insular and isolated time we live in, much of this universality to movements is lacking. Instead of finding a principled center from which to drive the common demands of all people, we find ourselves manipulated into accepting extremely narrow positions. In divided corners like these, we argue positions so far from our ideals and our reality, we forget there is a war taking place or peace to be had. The need for a sincere and critical analysis of our moment has never been more evident. The unending climb in violent crime and unemployment has no end in sight. The expanding number of prisons, tent cities, and open-air drug markets are fast becoming the only real growth in America for poor and working people. The obscene inequality which structures this mess has led our leaders to plan for a nuclear conflict in Asia with our environment on the edge of becoming uninhabitable. This is the threat Winston was referring to when he called fascism, quote, the genocidal consequences of anti-communism. It's what King warned of when he said, quote, a nation that continues year after year to spend more on money on military defense than on programs of social uplift is approaching spiritual death. Without hope, humanity will lose the will to fight. Without ideas that can truly unite us, we don't stand a fighting chance. To the youth wandering from one crumbling school building to the next, and each and every generation of children who dream of meaning, what will we tell them? What can we offer them if not something to believe in? For their humanity, as well as our own. Our awareness must rise high above our own individual pleasures, above the pain we have masked with entertainment and self-entitlement. We must follow those who marched for our humanity, hand in hand. Any awareness of Martin Luther King's name means very little without the consciousness to realize and actuate his ideas. In today's America, democracy, civil rights, and peace are defined in the abstract. These words glow out of the mouths of our nation's loudspeakers like banners of pride and accomplishment. The truth of these ideals, however, has yet to be realized by the broad masses of society. For these truths to reach their human potential, we must listen to the hoarse voice of the poor and humble among us in order to understand our world. For Winston, this is the weight of our task, to unify on the essence of principles rooted in struggle, and not acquiesce to the comforting cliche form we are given. Like a beacon beaming out from the fog, King's ideological clarity is vital to our survival. His blueprint for unity is just as priceless today as ever before. He places the power to change the course of history firmly in human hands. He speaks from a faith in humanity cultivated from a committed struggle among common people. A people who gave their lives and marched for an end to poverty, war, and oppression of any kind. He speaks to a revolution of values of which he witnessed and experienced firsthand from the transformation of these poorest and most humble among us into new human beings. It is by this fundamental connection to the plight of black and white working people that true leadership is born. It is precisely from this love of people that the principle of peace resides. If If we are truly interested in progressing as a society and as a people, we must embrace the struggle for peace. If ideas like civil rights, democracy, and freedom mean anything at all, they mean we must affirm the dignity of all human life. In doing so, we must be willing to sacrifice the things that bring us comfort from our government's insatiable drive to war. Insatiable subjugation of others. The material pleasures we enjoy are not as important as the life we lead. The sovereignty of any country is just as negotiable as our own. As Americans, we must firmly reject this culture which holds such casual disregard for the human casualties of war. As King and Winston demonstrated, we are citizens of the world. And as such, it is our responsibility to dedicate ourselves towards this fight. Thank you.
Margaret Walker, a renowned African-American black poet, wrote the poem For My People in 1942, when Henry Winston was 31 years old and had been led to the Communist Party as a young man by U.S. racism and the exploitation of workers, especially black workers. For My People captures the lives and loves and struggles of black urban America in the once touted promised land of the North and other areas outside of southern sharecropping Jim Crow states, even in areas like Kansas City. For my people everywhere singing their slave songs repeatedly, their dirges and their ditties, their blues and jubilees, praying their prayers nightly to an unknown God, bending their knees humbly to an unseen power. For my people lending their strength to the years, to the gone years and the now years and the maybe years, washing, ironing, cooking, scrubbing, sewing, mending, hoeing, plowing, digging, planting, pruning, patching, dragging along, never gaining, reaping never, knowing and never understanding. For the cramped and bewildered years, we went to school to learn, to know the reasons why and the answers to, and the people who, and the places where, and the days when, in memory of the bitter hours when we discovered we were black and poor and small and different, and nobody cared, and nobody wondered, and nobody understood. For my people, standing, staring, trying to fashion a better world, in a better way, from confusion, from hypocrisy, from misunderstanding, trying to fashion a world that will hold all the people, all the faces, all the atoms, and that will hold all the people, all the faces, all the atoms and Eves in their countless generations. Winston's family had left sharecropping and poverty in Mississippi to go west only to find for young Henry Winston a place where, like most other youth during that time, there were no jobs. The Great Depression had begun in 1929 and lasted until the 1930s. As he wandered the country looking for work, he became engrossed in organizing young workers and trying to fashion a world that will hold all the people, that will hold all the atoms and all the Eves for generations to come. And he became a member of the Communist Youth League, and subsequently he became a ranking member in the party in 1936 and finally chairman of the Communist Party from 1966 until 1986, when he passed in the Soviet Union while seeking medical treatment. Like Winston, many children left the South with their families to relocate in the rumored promised land in northern cities, only to find more poverty isolation, discrimination, and racial injustice still. As we in our public school classrooms, as educators and students, experience virtually through reading and discussing books like Richard Wright's Black Boy, which narrated his poverty-stricken youth in the South, as well as his still impoverished condition, as well as his living still in impoverished conditions in the north of Chicago, and Charles Brown's 1965 autobiographical novel, Man-Child in the Promised Land, which detailed Harlem living for black folks during the 40s and the 50s. However, the world outside, as well as inside of Chicago and Harlem, as well as U.S., had been changed and been changing because humanity was being championed by enlightened forces that drew inspiration from the November 7, 1917 October Revolution in Russia that ultimately led to the creation of the Soviet Union and subsequently the World Communist Movement. Humanity was standing on the edge of a dream, to borrow lyrics from Minnie Wellington. A dream of freedom. That creation and movement had a profound impact on the African struggles for liberation and national sovereignty, especially the southern African nations of South Africa, Namibia, Zambia, Angola, Mozambique, and Zimbabwe. That impact was felt by the Palestinians in Cuba, by the Chilean people, and all other oppressed peoples like those also in Northern Ireland seeking liberation from their colonial and even neo-colonial shackles. Thus, the anti-imperial, anti-colonial, anti-neo-colonial liberation and revolutionary struggles for self-determination and nation-building were materializing from 1922 with Egypt to Namibia in 1990 and South Africa in 1994. We can call this the decolonialization of Africa. Henry Winston spoke very clearly and decisively about the parallel struggles in Africa and in the United States. Struggles, though similar because they share a common enemy, but decisively different. The struggles of the peoples of Africa and those of African descent in the United States evoke memories of a common heritage, of the experience of centuries of struggle against racial and racist oppression. And it is natural that the exploited in every country and every race and every world create a special affinity between all Africans and blacks in the U.S. who are struggling against oppression on the home grounds of U.S. imperialism, one of the most powerful sources of oppression in Africa. This special affinity can add solidarity and strength to all the forces of class and national liberation, involving every race on every continent in the anti-imperial revolutionary process. And he warns us, however, that there is no substitution for the class struggle. The neo-Pan-Africanists like George Tagore confuse equating our affinity with each other with similar contexts of and stages in liberation struggle. Additionally, there are separatists, what Winston calls the skin strategy, and anti-communists, and generally tend to support bourgeois capitalism within the black community, entrepreneurialism especially. Winston stressed that they only serve to aid the racist monopolists in the United States in their offensive against the black liberation movement in the United States and against the independence and liberation in Africa. Their separatist skin strategy states that blacks must fight their liberation battles by themselves in the U.S. and in Africa, without the aid and support of socialist countries that could lessen and shorten the struggle. Winston names more well-known neo-Pan-Africanists who are following or did follow the ill-conceived footsteps of Marcus Garvey and his Back to Africa movement in 1922. Stokely Carmichael, or Kwame Ture, known for his Black Power stance, and there's a picture of him right back there outside of the Church of the Advocate. I was there when he said what he said. He didn't say much. All right. Which made similar statements in 1971. Roy Ennis, Congress Racial Equality, which Tony mentioned yesterday, and actually a supporter of black capitalism and black investment in Africa. You know, Winston identified this as a part of the neo-colonialist plan and strategies for Southern Africa. Zionism in Palestine, serving as the northern flank and a base against Soviet support of liberation struggles in Southern Africa. And that's the role that Zionism played. South Africa served at that time as the southern flank. U.S. direct support of blocking sanctions against Rhodesia, or known then as Rhodesia, but we know now as Zimbabwe, and NATO against the Portuguese colonies in Angola and Mozambique, with neo-Pan-Africanists, and whose names I mentioned, being propelled and promoted as the elite vanguard in the struggle to divert and destabilize liberation movements in Southern Africa. Winston identifies also James Forman and James Boggs among this group of black elites. I can look back on my experience with the anti-apartheid struggles and liberation movements in Southern Africa, especially South African media, and have a fuller understanding of what that work meant because of a broader context provided by Henry Winston and national and international events. The Bandung Conferences of 1995, 2005, and 2015, and the 10 Principles of Bandung adopted in 1995. The South African Freedom Charter of 1955, the Afro-Asian Writers' Conferences from 1958 until 1979, the Non-Alignment Movement, which began in 1961, and even the World Economic Forum. And unfortunately, the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, the Great Reset, and the Fourth International Conference, promoting a new world society with automated production administered by artificial intelligence. And that's a question that I think Raju kind of answered for me when he talked about China and the role that China is now playing in the world, because who will take the place, or what will take the place of the Soviet Union and the World Communist Movement, which supported many of the liberation movements throughout the world. And this was a sad loss, but I'm finally realizing the impact of it as I worked on this paper. So when I joined NAMESA, the National Anti-Imperialist Movement in solidarity with African liberation, leave the long names at the time. It was founded and headed by Dr. Tony Montero, Doc as you guys call him, who at the time was a member of the Communist Party. I guess this was in the early 70s, so somebody mentioned about us old folk. Well, yes, I'm one of those old folk. So now I have to date myself, and Doc, for that matter. And my friend Brenda and I were realizing our affinity with Africa, especially Southern Africa. She had a particular interest in Southwest Africa, known as Namibia. We had educational forums at Temple, guest speakers. We tried to raise the consciousness of black and other community members about apartheid and its brutal treatment of black people in South Africa. And by black people, I mean the Asians, the coloreds, and the Africans, because they all identified black, which was a significant and important identification when we talk about uniting the races in the struggle against imperialism. And for me, during that time, it was easy for me to understand Israel and Palestine because of my experiences with South Africa and the unity of all of the nations, national congresses, as in South Africa, the unity of all of the people who inhabited Palestine at the time. which of course you could only be a citizen in Israel if you were Jewish. If you were not Jewish, you could not be a citizen. In South Africa, it was, everybody who lives here belongs here and will be a citizen. So that was an important realization for me. So we did our work at Temple, and we also focused on the work that needed to be done in other areas, of the country, joining with other groups that were doing anti-apartheid work in New York, Washington, etc., and other people as well. So South Africa exported apartheid to the other colonial states in the region. So it was not just apartheid in South Africa, it was in Namibia, and it was exported to where South Africa had the most influence. White racist minorities had control of the land and natural resources, and were supported by U.S. imperialism especially. We compared those conditions to the conditions of the black experience with slavery, Jim Crow laws, segregation, and discrimination, because what we had learned from Martin Luther King Jr., the Civil Rights Movement, and even the struggles in Philly for equal rights and equal treatment under the law. Cecil B. Moore, the ministers like Shepard Marshall, or Marshall Shepard, and even Bill Gray Jr., as well as others. We became involved with and in the anti-apartheid struggles, getting to know and learn about the struggle firsthand because a number of the liberation cadre were in the schools in our area. Lincoln, where Dr. Montero attended, Temple, where I attended, the University of Penn, and Swarthmore. Our social and our political commitments became one with the struggles of the Southern African people. A few years later, Brennan and I and a few compatriots formed CAFSA, the Coalition for Free South Africa and Namibia, which was more focused on South Africa and Namibia. We also worked with what was then known as the Philadelphia ANC representative, Godfrey Sithole, don't laugh. Don't you? Our work remained the same. Outreach, educational events, some cultural events, speaking at the UN, speaking at large gatherings and events, and speaking at city council meetings, getting anti-apartheid legislation passed, and even connecting with churches and peace groups. The Women International League for Peace and Freedom and the Philadelphia chapter of the World Peace Council. We went wherever our work connected us to build a broader and more informed base of support. It was as though it was through the U.S. Peace Council that I went to Cuba in 1978 to its youth festival. Most liberation movements sent delegations, including the Vietnam delegation and the PLO delegation. We had opportunities to attend the educational sessions, learn about the Cuban Revolution, listen to Fidel talk to us in the Havana Square, where a huge portrait of Che looked down upon us. I got to see the Marxist-Leninist ideology in practice, to meet the children of the revolution, each one teach one thing, to travel to the countryside and listen to their stories, and to see how that little country blockaded by the U.S. managed to continue its revolution with the support of the Soviet Union, which it could not have done without it. In the early 1980s, there was a call to do an anti-apartheid all-night vigil on either Dr. King's birthday or the day he was assassinated. From this vigil, the Martin Luther King Anti-Apartheid Coalition was formed. And it was an umbrella group of many organizations, not just one. And so we continued our focus on Southern Africa with the inclusion of Zimbabwe through our friend Tafa Tailona Mahosa, who was from Zimbabwe, who attended Temple. And through Anand and George Dar, we were able to include our work with the Palestinian struggle and Israel's hidden connection and its economic relationship with South Africa. And through Jim White, we gained an alliance with the local Irish group fighting to free Northern Ireland from British colonialism. We had joint events as well as separate events, each supporting the other. We continued our lobbying against the Sullivan Principles, whose signatories were supposedly excused from the economic boycott of South Africa. The principles were developed by Leon Sullivan, a well-known black minister, but he was an apologist, however, for apartheid South Africa. We were calling for a boycott of South African products, cultural events, and U.S. businesses doing business in South Africa. On the other hand, however, the McGonigal principles were supported by the Irish Liberation Movement, so that we supported them in City Council, while we opposed the Southern Principles, which were not supported by the regional liberation movements. So we understood, we took our direction from the liberation movements. We did not assume we knew what we were doing. We understood that they would guide us in terms of what they felt we could do to help that anti-imperialist struggle in Southern Africa. We could and did compare the two separate states of Israel and South Africa and found many similarities: confiscation of the land, even family land, segregation, oppression, denial of civic human and democratic rights, discrimination, and so on. We also compared the situation in Northern Ireland, where the British maintained an armed presence on the streets of that country, denying the Catholic citizens equal rights with the Protestant, Britain being a Protestant nation. We learned that Martin Luther King was a hero in both countries, and this is important, with murals on the walls outside honoring him. And so we did not know that without the links with the Palestinian people, the PLO, and the Irish people in Sinn Féin. This is the solidarity of struggle Winston tells us is possible. Because the solidarity we saw was the solidarity between the Palestinian people and the South African people in the South African struggle, as well as the black people in the United States. The solidarity of the struggle in Northern Ireland and the people doing that struggle with the Southern African struggle and with the black struggle in the United States. However, that was not necessarily something that was realized by the Irish people in the United States, which, when we talk about racism, basically, it is something that affects white people as well as black people, though it affects us in different ways. And it separates us as it's intended to do. And so you see a situation where the people in Northern Ireland understood the struggle, but the people in the United States, of course, did not, and did not necessarily join in the struggle. However, because of the influence of the people in Northern Ireland in that liberation movement, it had a spillover effect in the United States. Because the Irish folk in the United States had been struggling against United States oppression, because they were the coal miners, and they formed organizations and they fought against that oppression, but it did not join us as black folks and Irish people together in the fight against oppression in the United States. So at any rate, okay, as I said, this was the solidarity struggle Winston tells us about. It's possible, multiracial, multicultural, multi-religious, as was suggested by the Freedom Charter of South Africa, as was manifested in the Bandung conferences, bringing Asian and African countries together 3 times over the decades to explore mutual support, alignment, and cultural exchanges apart from the West and its imperial design on Africa and Asia. It is in this spirit, when asked why our Irish compatriots, it was in this spirit that when asked by our Irish compatriots, I, along with Father Paul Washington, walked shoulder to shoulder in the Philadelphia Irish Parade, showing our solidarity with the struggling people of Northern Ireland. We were the only blacks participating in the parade. It was new and unique, a position that many had been, it was new and unique, a position that may have been uncomfortable for us, but was very comfortable in Northern Ireland. And so we had to learn, or the people in Philadelphia, Irish people in Philadelphia, had to begin to see that connection between the black struggle in the United States and the struggle for freedom in Northern Ireland. It was with this spirit of solidarity that in the mid-'80s I went to the Nazareth work camp in Israel, hosted by the then mayor of Nazareth, renowned Palestinian poet Tawfiq Sayed. I also toured the West Bank and Gaza, meeting the families, speaking with the women, seeing the frustration of the young men who made up more than half the population but had a nebulous future. I was not surprised when the Intifada followed, and understand the resistance would continue and did continue in the West Bank and Gaza because the oppression is daily, the injustice is raw, with so many left out, ignored, abused, and oppressed, and with no future. Clearly, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, which is organized like a government in exile and is recognized as the legitimate representative of the Palestinian people, despite U.S. and Israeli joint disinformation campaign. And it is with that experience that I came back renewed to support the Palestinian people here in the United States through our work in the Martin Luther King Anti-Apartheid Coalition. And so we talked about peace with justice and not just peace, because there can be no peace without justice. My friend Tafa expressed the frustration the liberation movements caused the imperialists in his poem about Elon Musk trying to go to space. He called it apartheid man, spacing out. After global journeys of exploration in search of unoccupied lands and finding none that did not belong to some native, we tried forced removals but ended up with Dimbaza and Gaza and allegations of genocide against Nama and Herrera. We tried exclusion, though through sealed, super-rich suburbs, but our children chose the attractions of the ghetto and gravitated there. We tried gentrification, but the rod of melting pot, the multi-sheep, ultimately recycled great real estate back together. So is it not time to forget earth-bound expeditions and projects of flight and take us nowhere? Now that the Mugabes of the earth have caught up with us and our tricks, there is not a single continent, not a single hostess stamp size area or stretch legroom without native claimants demanding to take it back through one liberation fight after another. However, the fall of the Soviet Union and the fall of the World Communist Movement, or the end of the World Communist Movement in 1991, has left a great big divide, as evidenced by the various African Marxist-Leninist liberation movements that have been undone or weakened for lack of clear ideology and principled leadership and support, and because of U.S. direct and indirect intervention to create neo-colonialist conditions and governments. So the People's Republic of People's Republic of Angola, which was the People's Republic which began in 1975 under MPLA, the People's Movement of the Liberation of Angola, ended in 1992 and just became the Republic of Angola. So you can see the shift. And it became clear that the impact that was felt on these movements and on these countries with the demise of the Soviet Union and the end of the World Communist Movement. the People's Republic of Mozambique, under the guidance of the Liberation Front of Mozambique, Frelimo, 1962, was a one-party Marxist-Leninist state from 1975 to 1990. It then had to create a new constitution in which it allowed for a multi-party system. And this is what is happening throughout. Zambia, the same thing. Single party, single state, that was the phrase. But by 1991, it had to create a new constitution in which it allowed for, again, multi-party governments. And one attack after the other. Now, we still have Namibia, 1990, in which it was liberated, but the influence of the West, and as Jahan pointed out, the economic stranglehold that the West has on these governments, of course, require that they make concessions. And so even though SWAPO, the then movement that led the revolutionary struggle, has weakened its stance, and of course they're not as strong as they would be. Now, I went to South Africa, but I didn't go to Namibia, and Doc says he will not go either. So, in South Africa, of course, under the ANC, the mighty ANC, which ultimately was and combined all of the movements, the Indian Congress, the Colored Congress, the trade unions, etc. It was a wonderful, wonderful experience to actually be part of that struggle and to understand the need for that country, for those people to gain its independence. Well, it got its independence, but at a cost. And the cost was the anti-imperial struggle. And so, unfortunately, Nelson Mandela made a deal. And so, the legacy he left is still tarnishing the ANC to this day, who is losing ground rather than gaining ground. Aside from U.S. direct intervention like Chile in 1970, Grenada in 1974, and I had just been to Grenada when the U.S. invaded Grenada, we have to acknowledge that the 2020 Great Reset, along with the Fourth Industrial Revolution, with its reliance on data gathering, algorithms, and artificial intelligence, this is designed to maintain and extend control over the global markets and continue Western imperialism and dominance over the darker peoples of the world. While countries in Africa were granted liberation or liberated themselves, wealthy and corporate capitalists began planning their next stage in 1971 with the creation of the World Economic Forum, an NGO that was founded by Klaus Schwab, and that led to the 2020 Great Reset with, of all people, Prince Charles of Wales. All right? So we have to remember that humanity is neither docile nor doormat. When we reflect on past human endeavors by peoples of the darker races to proclaim their love for truth and freedom, we have to remember that the Natal Indian Congress was formed by Mahatma Gandhi in 1894. That the Indian National Congress in India was founded in 1885. The first nationalist movement to emerge in the British Empire. And it was heavily influenced by and participated with, with the participation of Mahatma Gandhi. The African National Congress, ANC, was founded in 1912. the South African Indian Congress, 1919, with the participation of Mahatma Gandhi. And the independence of India from Britain, which actually came about because of the liberation activities and struggle from 1857 until 1947, including Gandhi's influence on the Out of India movement and the nonviolence and civil disobedience used both in South Africa as well as in Britain. So I'm finished. So I am reminded of a conversation I had with none of them. We spoke about Nkosi Sikelele, which is the anthem of the ANC, and now an altered rendition is the national anthem of South Africa. I was amazed to learn that that song was taught in the schools of India, and children learned it as well as the boot dance of South African miners. Here is that spirit of freedom and humanity which can be traced back to Mahatma Gandhi's resistance to oppression and the struggle for freedom in both South Africa and India. It's another reminder that the human spirit is indomitable and the culture of struggle is transported in inspiring ways even if the context has been misled.
Thank you, Emil and Catherine, for your beautiful presentations. Now we will break for lunch and then return for the second part of our programming today.